Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still have this awful pit in my stomach whenever I think about what happened that summer of '69. I was 17, and it was supposed to be our last hurrah at the old cabin before Mike and Trevor left for college. We'd found that place 3 summers earlier, just this forgotten logging cabin about 3 miles deep in the woods outside Myers Flat. Man, I remember being so proud when we discovered it, like we'd found buried treasure or something. It wasn't much to look at initially. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and there was evidence that animals had been using it as shelter. The door was this weird, short thing. Couldn't have been more than 5 feet high. Apparently, the old loggers who built these places weren't exactly basketball players, but we were just kids with nowhere else to hang out away from parents and rules, so we spent that first summer clearing it out, patching the roof with whatever we could find, and making it our own. By the 3rd summer, we had it looking pretty decent. We'd brought in some old mattresses, a couple of beat-up chairs, a small table, and even this ancient wood stove we found at a junkyard that Butch's dad helped us haul in. We'd stocked it with canned goods, some tools, playing cards, all the essentials for teenage boys in the wilderness. We even had an old kerosene lamp for light. It was primitive, but it was ours. That final weekend was supposed to be special. We'd hiked in on Friday afternoon with our backpacks full of supplies, mostly hot dogs, beans, and soda. I'd brought my .22 rifle thinking maybe we could do some small game hunting, though I rarely had the heart to actually shoot anything. The first day and night went exactly as planned. We hiked, explored, cooked over the fire pit we'd built outside, told the same old stories we always did, and crashed in our sleeping bags inside the cabin. Saturday was more of the same. We spent a lot of time just sitting around talking about the future, about how things would change, with some of us going away. It hit me hard that this era of our lives was ending. We stayed up late that night, none of us really wanting to go to sleep, because it meant tomorrow would come faster, and tomorrow meant heading back to town and ending this chapter. We finally turned in around midnight. The cabin was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, so we were all sleeping pretty close to each other on our sleeping bags. I remember waking up suddenly and checking my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, this weird huffing sound coming from outside. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was rhythmic, almost like heavy breathing, but deeper, more guttural. I lay there frozen for a few seconds, wondering if I was imagining things. Then I heard something heavy moving outside, circling around the cabin. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whatever it was stopped occasionally, and I could hear what sounded like sniffing and then scratching at the old wood walls. I reached over and shook Butch awake. He was always the toughest of our group, the one least likely to freak out. I whispered, "You hear that?" He nodded immediately, which confirmed I wasn't dreaming this up. We listened as the thing continued to circle the cabin. When it reached one of the corners, we heard a different sound, like it was testing the boards, maybe trying to find a way in. Some of the lower boards were pretty rotted, and we'd never gotten around to replacing them. Now I was wishing we had. "Should we wake the others?" Butch whispered. Before I could answer, Mike sat up. He must have been sleeping lightly. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice a little too loud. "Shh," I hissed. "There's something outside." That woke Trevor and Danny. Now all 5 of us were sitting up in our sleeping bags, completely still, listening to whatever was outside as it continued its methodical circuit around our cabin. The huffing had gotten louder, and occasionally there was this low sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a rumble. "Bear?" Trevor suggested, his voice trembling slightly. I shook my head. "Doesn't move like a bear." I'd encountered black bears in these woods before. They were usually noisy, crashing through underbrush. This thing was moving with purpose, deliberately. The footsteps continued around to the front of the cabin. They stopped right outside the door, that short, 5-foot-high door that we'd always joked was made for hobbits. The huffing was so loud now we could hear it clearly through the old wooden boards. Then something pushed against the door. Not hard, just testing it. The wood creaked, and we all flinched. The latch was just a simple wooden bar across 2 brackets. It would hold against the wind or small animals, but if whatever was out there decided to really push... Butch suddenly scrambled over to where my backpack was. He pulled out my .22 rifle and checked to make sure it was loaded. "We need to see what it is," he whispered. "Are you crazy?" Danny hissed. He was the youngest of us, just 15, and I could see he was terrified. It could just be some hiker who got lost, Butch reasoned, though I don't think he believed that any more than the rest of us did. Lost hikers don't circle cabins in the middle of the night, huffing and testing for weak spots. The thing outside pushed against the door again, harder this time. The wooden bar creaked. We all stared at each other, wide-eyed. "We can't just sit here waiting for it to break in," Butch insisted. He was right in a way. The cabin had no back door, no windows big enough to climb through. If that thing outside decided to come in, we were trapped. Butch moved toward the door, rifle in hand. "I'm going to look. Jason, come with me." I didn't want to, but I couldn't let him go alone. The others stayed huddled in the center of the cabin, watching us. We crept to the door. The huffing was so loud now, I swear I could feel the air moving through the cracks around the doorframe. Butch positioned himself to the side, rifle ready, and nodded at me to lift the bar. My hands were shaking so bad I almost couldn't do it. I've never been so scared in my life, before or since. I took a deep breath, grabbed the wooden bar, and slowly lifted it from the brackets. Butch reached forward and pushed the door open just a crack, maybe 6 inches. The huffing sound immediately stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then Butch opened the door a bit wider, just enough to peek out. His face went completely white. He stumbled back a step, raising the rifle. I couldn't help myself. I had to see. I moved forward and looked out through the gap in the door. It was dark outside, but not completely black. There was enough moonlight filtering through the trees that I could make out what was directly in front of the cabin. And what I saw were 2 massive, hairy legs. Not human legs, not bear legs either. They were thick as tree trunks, covered in dark, matted hair or fur, standing directly in front of our door. Just the legs. The rest of whatever it was extended up beyond my line of sight through the partially opened door. The thing had been standing slightly to the side of the door, which is why we hadn't seen it immediately. Now it shifted, and I heard that deep huffing sound again, right above my head. Butch didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open wider and fired the rifle. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The creature let out the most horrifying scream I've ever heard, not like an animal, not like a person, but something in between. It was so loud it seemed to shake the entire cabin. Then it moved. It spun around so fast that the ground outside the cabin door seemed to churn up. Through the now open door, I caught a glimpse of something massive disappearing into the trees, a huge, dark shape moving with shocking speed for its size. Butch slammed the door shut, and I fumbled to get the wooden bar back in place. We retreated to the center of the cabin, where the other 3 were huddled. No one spoke for what seemed like an eternity. The only sound was our ragged breathing and Danny quietly crying. "What the hell was that?" Trevor finally whispered. "I don't know," Butch replied, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "But I hit it. I know I hit it." We sat in a tight circle in the middle of the floor for the rest of the night. No one suggested trying to sleep. We kept the rifle in the center of our circle, taking turns holding it, though I doubt any of us really believed it would help much if that thing came back. The .22 was meant for squirrels and rabbits, not whatever that was. Every sound from the forest made us jump. A branch creaking in the wind, an owl hooting. The normal sounds of the woods that had never bothered us before now seemed menacing. When the first light of dawn finally came through the cracks in the walls, we were all still awake, exhausted and terrified. We debated whether to just grab our stuff and run or wait for full daylight. Caution won out, and we waited until the sun was properly up before Butch and I dared to open the door again. The area in front of the cabin showed clear signs of what had happened. The ground where the creature had stood was churned up with deep impressions that didn't look like any animal track I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, but not shaped quite like a foot either. More rounded, with what looked like claw marks at the front. We followed the tracks to where the thing had spun around after Butch shot it. The earth was torn up there, with deep gouges where it had pushed off to run into the forest. The tracks led away into the trees, and they were spaced far apart. Whatever made them had been moving fast and taking massive strides. What confused us was that there was no blood. Butch insisted he had hit it, and he was a good shot. We looked carefully along the track line, but found nothing to indicate the bullet had done any damage. None of us suggested following the tracks further into the forest. By unspoken agreement, we went back to the cabin, packed our stuff faster than we ever had before, and left. We didn't even bother with breakfast. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. The hike back to where we'd left Mike's car, parked on an old logging road, was the tensest 3 miles of my life. We kept looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. No one talked much. What was there to say? We never went back to that cabin. Never even discussed going back. Sometimes, when we'd get together in the years that followed, one of us would start to bring it up, but someone else would quickly change the subject. It was like we'd made a pact without words to never really talk about what happened. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what we encountered that night. Could it have been a bear walking on its hind legs? A particularly tall hiker with some kind of gear that made his legs look strange in the dark? Some kind of prank by other local kids who knew about our cabin? None of those explanations fit what we saw and heard. That huffing sound, those massive, fur-covered legs, the incredible speed with which it moved through dense forest, the fact that a .22 bullet didn't even slow it down. I still live in Northern California, not far from Myers Flat. I still hike and fish and spend time in the woods. But I never go alone, I never go at night, and I never ever stay in remote cabins anymore. And when I'm in the forest and hear something moving through the underbrush that doesn't sound quite right, something too deliberate, too careful, I turn around and head back to civilization as quickly as I can. I don't know what we encountered that summer night in 1969, but whatever it was, it changed something fundamental in me. That absolute certainty I once had, that I understood the world and what exists in it. Now I look at the dense forests that cover so much of this region and wonder what else might be out there, watching and waiting in the darkness. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 30 years now. It's not that I didn't want to talk about it, but every time I tried, people either laughed it off or gave me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to figure out if you're crazy or just making stuff up. But what happened that night in '92 at Stony Lagoon has never left me, and I still get chills thinking about it. My buddy Chris and I were planning a weekend fishing trip up to the mouth of the Climate River in Humboldt County. We were both in our mid-20s, grew up in Northern California, and spent most of our free time outdoors. This was before cell phones were really a thing, and definitely before GPS. Just two guys on motorcycles with paper maps and a sense of adventure. It was late May, and the weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. We'd been riding for about 4 hours when we hit Oric in the early afternoon. We were making good time, but Chris suggested we stop at Stony Lagoon, about 3 to 4 miles south of Oric, to camp for the night instead of pushing on. Neither of us had been there before, but he'd heard from some co-workers it was a good spot, quiet and away from the tourists. Getting to the lagoon was a bit tricky on our bikes. We had to navigate over this small hill through several hundred feet of pretty dense brush and trees. Nothing too technical, but enough that not many people would bother. That was part of the appeal, finding spots that felt like they belonged just to us. When we finally broke through the brush, we found ourselves in this perfect little camping area near the beach. The spot was clearly used by others before. There was an old fire ring made of rocks and a few logs positioned as makeshift seats. The Pacific stretched out in front of us, and with the sun getting lower, we knew we'd made the right call, stopping here. We parked our bikes about 10 feet apart, unloaded our gear, and set up camp. I remember being so struck by how quiet it was, just the sound of waves and the occasional seabird. We gathered driftwood and built a small fire, laid out our sleeping bags, and broke out some beers we'd packed. The moon was full that night, and it reflected off the ocean so brightly that we barely needed our flashlight. I remember joking with Chris that we were saving on batteries. We must have been sitting there for about an hour after sunset, just shooting the shit about work, girls, and where we wanted to go fishing the next day. The fire was crackling, beer was cold, and everything felt perfect. I was mid-sentence when I noticed something moving down by the waterline. About 100 feet west of our camp, and maybe 30 feet from the water's edge, I spotted this figure walking, no, more like trotting, southward down the beach. At first, I thought it was just another camper or someone taking a late-night stroll, but something about the way it moved made me stop talking. "Hey, you see that?" I nudged Chris and pointed. He squinted toward the beach. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" In the moonlight, I could make out that this thing was tall, really tall. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet, and it wasn't thin either. Broad shoulders, big frame. The moonlight only showed its silhouette, but there was no mistaking that this wasn't just some tall guy walking on the beach. Chris, always the more outgoing one, called out, "Hey, you there!" The figure didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't even seem to register that we were there. It just kept moving at that same steady pace southward down the beach. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't jogging exactly, more like a smooth, efficient trot that covered ground quickly. Something about its gait was just off, too fluid for something that big. "Should we check it out?" Chris asked, already reaching for the flashlight. I hesitated. "I don't know, man." But curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed the flashlight, one of those big mag lights that's practically a weapon, and headed toward the beach. By the time we got to where we'd seen the figure, it was gone. Disappeared down the beach without a trace. What we did find, though, made my skin crawl. Footprints, enormous footprints in the damp sand near the water's edge. They were about 6 inches wide and at least 12 to 14 inches long. But the most unsettling part was the distance between them. They were spaced about 10 feet apart. "Jesus Christ," Chris whispered, crouching down to examine one of the prints. "What kind of stride is that? That's not human." I remember trying to pace it out myself, taking big, exaggerated steps, and I couldn't come close to matching the distance. To leave prints spaced that far apart, whatever made them would have had to be running at an incredible speed or have legs much longer than any human I'd ever seen. But the prints didn't show signs of someone running. They were evenly pressed into the sand, like whatever made them was just walking at a casual pace. The prints led south down the beach, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlight. Part of me wanted to follow them, to see where they went, but a stronger part was saying this was something we shouldn't mess with. "Let's head back to camp," I said, and Chris didn't argue. When we got back to our fire, I noticed it had died down quite a bit. We threw on some more wood, but the carefree vibe from earlier was gone. We sat in silence for a while, both processing what we'd seen. "You think it was a person?" Chris finally asked. I shook my head. "No way. Did you see the size of those footprints and the distance between them? Nobody can walk like that." Chris nodded, taking a long swig of his beer. "Maybe it was a..." He trailed off. "A what?" He shrugged. "You know what people say about these woods." I did know. Growing up in Northern California, we'd all heard the stories. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. As kids, we'd scare each other with tales around campfires, but as adults, we'd laugh them off. I wasn't laughing now. It was probably around 10:30 or 11 when Chris suddenly sat up straight, his body tensing. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened. At first, nothing but the waves and the crackling fire. Then I heard it, a rustling in the brush behind our camp, the sound of branches moving, of something large pushing through the undergrowth. Chris grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense brush about 40 feet behind our motorcycles. For a split second, I swear, I saw something reflect back at us, 2 points of light, like eyes catching the flashlight beam. "Did you see that?" Chris's voice was barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. The rustling continued, moving slowly along the perimeter of our campsite, just out of clear view in the brush. It wasn't like an animal moving. Animals crash through brush or move stealthily. This was deliberate, almost like whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. Chris kept the flashlight trained on the source of the sound. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Who's there?" The rustling stopped. Complete silence fell over our camp, broken only by the sound of waves in the distance. We waited, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a sound I still have trouble describing. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a breath, more like a deep, rumbling exhalation that seemed to reverberate in my chest. I felt it more than heard it. "We need to go," I said, already reaching for my sleeping bag. "Now." Chris didn't argue. We packed up in record time, not bothering to properly put out the fire, just kicking sand over it hastily. The entire time, I could feel eyes on us from the darkness. Not once did I turn my back to the brush. We threw our gear onto our bikes, and I remember my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice trying to get them into the ignition. The bike roared to life, and I've never been so grateful for the sound of an engine. As we were about to head out, Chris pointed his flashlight one last time toward the brush line. What I saw in that final sweep has stayed with me for decades. Just at the edge of the brush, partially obscured by branches, was a massive figure. It was hard to make out details in the quick glimpse we got, but I could see it was standing upright, far taller than any man I've known. Its body seemed covered in dark hair or fur, and its eyes reflected the flashlight with an eerie yellowish-green glow. We didn't wait around to see more. We gunned our engines and tore through the brush path we'd come in on. I've never ridden so recklessly in my life, branches whipping at my arms and face, the bike bouncing over roots and rocks. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road, and even then, we rode for another hour before stopping at an all-night diner in the next town. Sitting in that brightly lit diner at 1 a.m., our hands still shaking as we clutched cups of coffee, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. The figure on the beach, the impossibly large footprints, the eyes in the darkness, and that thing we glimpsed as we left. None of it fit into the world as I knew it. We ended up cancelling our fishing trip and heading home the next day. Chris and I talked about it constantly for weeks afterward, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. Was it some kind of prank? A very tall person with a weird gait? But deep down, we both knew what we'd seen wasn't human. Eventually, we stopped talking about it. Not because we'd forgotten or because it seemed less real, but because we couldn't stand the disbelieving looks, the dismissive laughs, the suggestions that maybe we'd had too many beers. So we kept it between us. Chris moved to Oregon in '98, and we gradually lost touch. I sometimes wonder if he still thinks about that night as much as I do. I've never been back to Stony Lagoon, and I never will. I can rationalize most things in life. I'm a practical person. But what I saw that night doesn't fit into any explanation I can come up with. The casual way it trotted down the beach, the impossible distance between its footprints, the way it seemed to circle our camp, watching us. It was intelligent, it was massive, and it was nothing I can explain. I've read accounts from others who've had similar experiences in the Humboldt area. Some claim they've seen Bigfoot, others call it something else. I don't know what label to put on what we saw that night. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows of our knowledge. And sometimes, when I'm camping and I hear branches breaking in the darkness beyond my fire, I remember those eyes reflecting in the flashlight beam, and I wonder if it's out there still, walking the beaches and forests of Northern California, watching and waiting for the next group of campers who stray too far from the beaten path. Story 3. I've struggled with whether to share this for a long time. It happened back in August 1991, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some experiences just burn themselves into your brain, you know? This is one of those times I wish I could forget, but I can't. Not a week goes by that I don't think about what my buddy Eric and I saw out there. We were both pretty experienced outdoorsmen. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a kid, and Eric was an avid hunter who knew his way around the wilderness better than most park rangers. We'd planned this trip to Klamath National Forest for months, just a weekend getaway, nothing fancy. The area west of the Klamath River in Northern California is gorgeous that time of year. Not too many tourists, perfect weather, good fishing. We parked at the trailhead early Friday morning. The plan was to follow the Klamath River northward for about 6 miles, then find a nice spot to set up camp. The hike-in was uneventful, just beautiful scenery, fresh air, and good conversation with an old friend. Around mid-afternoon, we noticed a small feeder stream coming in from the west. It looked pristine, and Eric suggested we follow it to find a more secluded camping spot. "Fewer people mean more fish for us," he'd said with that grin of his. I agreed, and we headed west along the stream. About a mile in, we found a perfect clearing near the stream. It had a flat area for our tent, good tree coverage for shelter, and a natural fire pit that someone had made previously. We set up camp, gathered firewood, and spent the rest of the afternoon fishing. By early evening, we had caught enough trout for dinner and were sitting by the fire, just relaxing. That's when things started getting weird. The sun was setting, and we were both quiet, just staring into the flames and enjoying the peace. The forest around us grew quieter too, as it often does at dusk, but then it got too quiet. You know that feeling when the birds suddenly stop singing? When the constant background noise of the forest just stops? That's what happened. Eric noticed it first. He sat up straight, cocked his head to one side and whispered, "You hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. "Exactly," he said. "Nothing." We both listened for a minute, and he was right. The normal sounds of the forest had ceased completely. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. It was eerie, but I tried to rationalize it. Probably just a predator nearby. Mountain lion, maybe, I suggested. Eric nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We went back to our dinner, but the mood had shifted. There was tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We turned in early that night, tired from the hike and planning to get up at dawn to fish. I fell asleep almost immediately, but it couldn't have been more than a couple of hours later when I felt Eric shaking me awake. "Dave," he whispered urgently. "Dave, wake up." I opened my eyes to find the tent completely dark. The fire had died down to embers outside. "What?" I mumbled, still half asleep. "Listen," Eric said, his voice tense. I sat up and listened. At first I heard nothing, then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of something moving on the exposed rocks above our campsite. Our tent was positioned at the base of a small ridge, with a rocky slope leading up to higher ground. Whatever was up there was big, and it was moving deliberately. I felt my heart rate spike. Eric had already grabbed his 9mm pistol from his pack and was holding it at his side. We both sat perfectly still, straining our ears. The footsteps, if you could call them that, weren't like anything I'd heard before. Not a deer or elk, definitely not a human. Too heavy, too purposeful. The thing would move a few feet, stop, then move again. Occasionally, there was the sound of it jumping short distances between rocks, landing with a weight that made my stomach tighten. "Bear," I whispered, though I already knew it wasn't. Eric shook his head slightly. We'd both encountered bears in the wild before. This was different. We listened as whatever it was circled around behind our camp, moving along the ridge. It seemed to be making its way down toward the meadow where the stream cut through. Neither of us spoke or moved. I was afraid to even breathe too loudly. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15-20 minutes, the sounds grew more distant. Eric motioned toward the tent opening. Slowly, carefully, we unzipped it just enough to peer out. The moon was nearly full that night, casting the meadow in a silvery glow. The stream reflected the moonlight, cutting a shimmering path through the grass. And there, about 75 yards away, was a figure. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. The figure was standing upright, bipedal at the edge of the stream. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. In the moonlight, I couldn't make out details, just a large, dark silhouette against the silver meadow grass. We watched, frozen, as it crossed the stream. It moved with a smooth gait that was unmistakably not human, yet not quite animal either. As it reached the opposite bank, it slipped slightly, one foot, or hand, or whatever, gouging into the soft earth. It recovered quickly and continued moving at an angle away from us, toward the tree line on the far side of the meadow. Neither of us spoke until the figure disappeared into the forest. Even then, we only whispered. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to say, my mouth dry with fear. Eric shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, "but it wasn't a bear." "Bigfoot," I suggested, immediately feeling stupid for saying it out loud. "I don't know what it was," Eric repeated, "but it was watching us. It circled our camp before going down there. It knew we were here." That thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Whatever that thing was, it had been aware of us. It had moved around our campsite, possibly observing us, before making its way across the meadow. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the tent, Eric with his pistol ready, me with my hunting knife, and waited for dawn. We talked in hushed tones about what we'd seen. Both of us agreed on the basic facts. It was large, it walked on 2 legs, and it moved in a way that neither of us had ever seen before. "Did you notice how quiet it was?" Eric asked at one point. "Something that size should have made more noise." He was right. Despite its obvious weight, the thing had moved with an unsettling stealth. Even when it was on the rocks, the sounds were less than you'd expect from something so massive. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we cautiously emerged from the tent. Part of me wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there immediately, but curiosity won out. We needed to see if there was any evidence of what we'd witnessed. We made our way down to the stream crossing, to the spot where we'd seen the figure slip on the bank. What we found there made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth of the bank, was a gouge where something massive had dug in. It wasn't a clear footprint. The bank had partially collapsed when the thing slipped, but the size of the disturbance was shocking. I placed my arm next to it for comparison, and the gouged area was longer than the distance from my fingertips to my elbow. Over 19 inches, easily. Eric and I exchanged glances. Without speaking, we both knew we were seeing evidence of something that shouldn't exist. We looked across to the meadow beyond the stream. In the early morning light, we could clearly see where something heavy had passed through. The grass was pressed down in a path about 2 feet wide, leading toward the tree line just as we'd observed the night before. The trail was still visible because the grass hadn't had time to spring back up yet. Whatever made it had passed through only hours ago. I took a step toward the forest where the trail led, but Eric put a hand on my shoulder. "Don't," he said simply. He was right. Following that trail into the trees would have been madness. Whatever had made it was likely still in there, and neither of us wanted a closer encounter. We returned to our campsite in silence and packed up in record time. Neither of us suggested staying for more fishing or exploring. We wanted out. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. We moved quickly, barely speaking, both of us constantly scanning the forest around us. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made us freeze. It wasn't until we reached the car that I felt like I could breathe normally again. Sitting in the car, about to drive away, Eric finally broke the silence. "We need to decide what we're going to tell people," he said. "What do you mean? About what we saw, what we're going to say if anyone asks?" I thought about it for a moment. "Nothing," I finally said. "Who would believe us anyway?" Eric nodded slowly. "Yeah, probably best." And that's what we did. For years, I never told anyone except my wife. And even she looked at me with that skeptical expression that said she thought I was exaggerating or had been spooked by a bear. Eric and I never went back to that specific area, though we did continue to go camping and hiking in other places. We rarely talked about what happened, but sometimes, sitting around a campfire, one of us would catch the other's eye, and I knew we were both thinking about it. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what we saw. Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs? No, the way it moved was all wrong. A man in a suit, in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road, and no human could have made that gouge in the earth or moved with such weight. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids, but I've never been fully convinced by any of the theories. All I know for certain is what Eric and I experienced that night in August 1991. Something was out there, something big, something that moved like nothing I've ever seen before or since, something that knew we were there and chose to observe us before moving on. I still go camping, I still love the outdoors, but I never stay in one spot for too long anymore, and I never camp near the Climate River. Some places, once you've seen what's really there, you can never look at the same way again. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, if it remembers us the way we remember it, if it's watching other campers, other hikers, making its way silently through the forest on 2 legs, leaving behind only the faintest evidence of its passage. And I wonder what would have happened if it had decided not to just observe us that night, if it had decided to come closer. Story 4. I still catch myself searching the tree line sometimes. Doesn't matter if I'm driving the cruiser on patrol or just taking my kids to soccer practice. My eyes drift to the edges of the forest, looking for movement that doesn't belong. It's been over 30 years since that morning in Northern California, but I can still see it like it happened yesterday. Let me back up. I'm a cop, or was, before retirement. Seattle PD for 26 years. I've seen plenty of stuff in my career that would curl your toes. Domestic violence calls that turned ugly, fatal car wrecks, the works. I've been trained to observe, to notice details others miss, to keep a level head when everything goes sideways. You develop a certain instinct for when something's not right. That's why what happened back in '92 has stuck with me all these years, because I can't explain it away no matter how hard I try. It was early July, maybe the 5th or 6th. I had 2 weeks off, and we decided to take the kids down the coast. My wife Diane and I packed up our Chevy Suburban with the camping gear, loaded our 3 kids in the back. Tommy was 12, Sarah 9, and little Max just 6, and headed south from Seattle. The plan was to hit the Oregon coast, then cruise down into Northern California to see the redwoods. We'd spent the previous night at a KOA campground near the Oregon-California border. Nothing fancy, just a place to pitch the tent and let the kids run around a bit. Tommy and Sarah spent the evening catching frogs by a little creek, while Max collected sticks for the campfire. Normal family vacation stuff. We broke camp early the next morning, maybe 5:30 a.m. I've always been an early riser, even on vacation, and I wanted to hit Humboldt Redwood State Park before the crowds. Plus, driving that stretch of Highway 101 through the redwoods without a bunch of RVs and tourists clogging the road is something else. The morning was cool and foggy, typical for that part of California in the summer. The kids were still half asleep in the back. Tommy had his Walkman on, Sarah was reading one of those babysitter's club books, and Max was zonked out against the window, clutching the stuffed dinosaur he couldn't sleep without. Diane was navigating with the paper maps spread across her lap. This was way before GPS and smartphones. We'd been on the road maybe an hour, making good time. The fog was starting to burn off as the sun came up. We were heading south on 101, somewhere between Garberville and the Avenue of the Giants. This stretch of highway runs alongside the Eel River for miles. It's gorgeous country, dense forests coming right down to the road on one side, the river winding along the other. I remember we'd just come around this big sweeping curve. The road was elevated a bit above the river, giving us a clear view down to the water. Traffic was practically non-existent at that hour, just us and the occasional logging truck. That's when I saw it. At first it was just movement that caught my eye. Something big moving near the riverbank. When you're a cop, you develop this peripheral vision, this awareness of motion. So even though I was focused on the road, I immediately registered something substantial moving down by the water. I slowed the Suburban a bit, not dramatically, just eased off the gas. The river had this wide, rocky sandbar at that point, with the main channel maybe 50 yards from the tree line. Whatever I was seeing was walking, and I mean walking, not running on all fours, from the water's edge toward the forest. My first thought, honestly, was that it was someone fishing, maybe some local who'd gotten an early start. But as I kept watching, I realized several things all at once that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This thing was huge. I'm talking at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. And it wasn't a human in fishing waders. The proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too low, almost to the knees. The shoulders were massive, like a linebacker on steroids. And the coloration, this reddish-brown that didn't match any clothing a hunter or fisherman would wear. But what really got me was the way it moved. You know that famous Patterson footage from the 60s? The one with the supposed Bigfoot walking across the creek bed? I'd seen it before, of course, everyone has. And I always figured it was just some guy in a monkey suit. This thing moved exactly like that. The same distinctive gait, that same fluid swing of the arms, that same strange head position, sort of hunched forward. Except this wasn't grainy footage on a TV screen. This was happening right in front of me, in broad daylight, maybe 200 yards away. I'm not prone to flights of fancy. Never have been. Part of being a good cop is assessing situations rationally. So I ran through the possibilities in my head, almost automatically. Bear? No way. I've seen plenty of bears. Bears don't walk upright for extended periods like that. Their movements are completely different. Man in a costume, out here, at 6:30 in the morning, miles from any town. And the movement was too natural, too fluid. I had both hands gripping the steering wheel now, and I'd slowed to maybe 45 in mepinedunda. I kept my eyes moving between the road and the creature, trying to maintain a normal driving pattern, while also taking in every detail I could. It never looked our way. just kept that deliberate pace across the sandbar toward the tree line. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 30-40 seconds before it disappeared into the forest. But in those seconds, I saw enough to know that whatever that was, it wasn't anything I'd encountered before. I didn't say anything right away, didn't point or shout. 20 years of police work teaches you to observe first, react later. Plus, I honestly didn't know what to say. Hey, look at the Bigfoot. I'd have sounded crazy, even to myself. We drove for maybe another 5 miles in silence. The kids were still doing their own things in the back. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to convince myself I'd misinterpreted something. But I couldn't shake it off. The image was too clear, the circumstances too perfect. Good visibility, elevated vantage point, slow-moving vehicle. Finally, I cleared my throat and glanced at Diane. Hey, did you notice anything unusual back there, by the river a few minutes ago? I kept my tone casual, deliberately vague. Didn't want to lead her or put ideas in her head. That's interview 101. Let the witness tell you what they saw. Don't tell them what they should have seen. Diane looked up from her map, frowning slightly. You mean that person walking by the water? My stomach did a little flip. Yeah. What did you think about that? She hesitated, folding the map slowly. I was going to ask you the same thing. It looked... I don't know, James. It didn't look right. I thought maybe it was some kind of wildlife, but... But what? Well, it was walking like a person, but it was huge. And hairy. So she'd seen it too. And without me pointing it out or describing it first. From the back seat, Sarah's voice piped up. I saw it too, Dad. Was that a monster? I almost swerved. I hadn't realized she'd been watching. What did you see, honey? The big, hairy man by the river. He was walking to the trees. 3 independent observations, same details, no cross-contamination of memories. If this had been witness statements for a case, I'd have considered it solid. Tommy pulled off his headphones. What are you guys talking about? Max was still asleep, thank goodness. The last thing I needed was my youngest having nightmares about forest monsters for the rest of the trip. I didn't answer right away. What was I supposed to say? That I, James Wilson, 15-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department, father of 3, responsible adult and sworn officer of the law, was pretty sure we'd just seen Bigfoot. Instead, I just said, we saw something interesting by the river, probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and I knew it. We stopped for breakfast at a diner in Redway about 20 minutes later. While Diane took the kids to the bathroom, I asked the waitress, casually I thought, if people ever reported seeing unusual wildlife in the area. Oh, sure, she said, refilling my coffee. We get all sorts around here. Bears, mountain lions, you name it. Anything bigger? I pressed. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. You mean like Bigfoot? I must have made some kind of face because she laughed. Don't worry, you're not the first tourist to ask. Around here, everybody's got a story. My uncle swears he saw one up near Bluff Creek back in '87, says it was at least 8 feet tall. Do you believe him? I asked. She shrugged. I believe he believes it. These forests are huge. Who knows what's living out there? Who knows indeed? We continued our vacation as planned, saw the big trees, took pictures of the kids standing in redwood hollows, collected the junior ranger badges, normal stuff, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. That night, after we'd set up camp at Burlington Campground and the kids were asleep, I brought it up with Diane again. We were sitting by the fire, the tall redwoods creaking gently in the breeze above us. About what we saw this morning, I began. I knew you'd come back to this, she said, poking the fire with a stick. You've been distracted all day. I'm trying to make sense of it, I admitted. In 20 years of police work, I've never seen anything I couldn't explain until today. You think it was really? She couldn't even finish the sentence. I don't know what it was, I said honestly, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I've ever encountered before. We talked in circles for a while, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe it was a bear that just happened to be standing strangely. Maybe the angle and the early morning light played tricks on us. But we both knew better. The rest of the vacation passed normally enough, though I found myself scanning the forests more carefully, jumping at shadows among the trees. I didn't mention what we'd seen to anyone else. What would be the point? Without evidence, it was just another vacation story, another claimed sighting that would be dismissed as imagination or misidentification. But I know what I saw, what we saw. I've spent decades since then trying to make sense of it. I've read books on the subject, watched documentaries, even drove back down to that same stretch of highway a few years later, alone, just to see the location again in daylight. Nothing was there, of course. Just the river, the sandbar, the forest. I never filed any official report, never contacted any Bigfoot researchers or cryptozoology groups. I've told the story to exactly 3 people outside my immediate family in 30 years. Most of the time, the reaction is polite skepticism at best, outright disbelief at worst. And I get it. I do. If someone had told me this story before that morning in July '92, I'd have had the same reaction. That's why I've mostly kept it to myself. But here's the thing. As a police officer, I was trained to observe, to remember details, to assess situations objectively. I've testified in court dozens of times, sworn statements that put people in prison based on what I witnessed. My ability to accurately report what I've seen has never been questioned. And what I saw that morning on Highway 101 was real. It's changed how I look at the world. How can it not? There's something out there in those forests that science says doesn't exist. Something that hides well enough, moves quietly enough, that it's remained mostly undocumented despite centuries of human expansion. I still think about it when I'm driving near forests, still find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see another one. I probably won't. Lightning rarely strikes twice. But every time I hear someone dismiss Bigfoot stories as nonsense, I just nod and keep quiet. Because I know better, and so does my family. Whatever it was we saw that morning by the Eel River, it wasn't human. And it wasn't any known animal, it was something else entirely. Something that, according to conventional wisdom, shouldn't exist. But it does. I saw it. And nothing, not 30 years of rational thinking, not my law enforcement background, not my natural skepticism, nothing has convinced me otherwise. Some mysteries don't get solved, some questions don't get answered, and some mornings on Highway 101 change your understanding of the world forever. Story 5. I've been hesitating to share this for months now. Part of me feels like I must be crazy, but I know what I saw. I've worked as a marine biologist in Humboldt County for nearly 8 years, and I spent 3 years before that as a horse patrol ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm trained to observe, document, and analyze. Not to make things up or exaggerate. This happened back in January during that weird warm spell we had before the big storms hit. The river was starting to rise from the early rains, and I knew it would be my last chance to fish before everything got too muddy. The forecast showed heavier rain coming that night, but it was just a light drizzle when I decided to head out around 3 p.m. I drove to my usual spot along the river, about 20 minutes outside of Arcata. It's this little unmarked pull-off that most people miss, just a dirt patch where you can park maybe 30 yards from the water's edge. There are thick willows all around, and you have to push through some brush to get to the water, but it's worth it, because hardly anyone fishes there. The place was deserted when I arrived, which wasn't surprising given the weather. I parked facing away from the river, grabbed my gear from the trunk, and was just about to close my door when I heard it. 2 distinct bellows echoed through the air, maybe from across the river or upstream. I froze immediately. I've heard a lot of animal calls over the years, especially during my time as a ranger. This wasn't an elk bugle, though it had similarities. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like a cross between a whale's call and an elk. There was something distinctly primate-like about it too, which made no sense in these woods. I stood there for a good minute, listening for more sounds, but heard nothing but the soft patter of rain on leaves and the rush of the river. My scientific mind immediately tried to catalogue it, maybe unusual acoustics distorting a known animal call. Perhaps some tourist playing a weird recording as a joke. But it didn't fit anything I knew. After a couple minutes of silence, I chalked it up to some weird acoustic anomaly and continued getting ready. I pulled on my waders, grabbed my rod and tackle box, and made my way through the willows to the riverbank. The water was higher than normal, but still manageable, about thigh-deep near the edge. The current was strong but not dangerous yet, though the water was already taking on that muddy pre-flood color. The rain had picked up slightly, creating a constant patter on my rain jacket hood that made it hard to hear anything subtle. I waded in carefully, feeling the familiar tug of the current against my legs. Despite the weather, it felt good to be out there. The river seemed off-color but still fishable, so I started working my way downstream, casting toward deeper pools. I'd been fishing for maybe 10 minutes, slowly moving downstream when I got that feeling. You know that sensation when you suddenly realize you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to look across the river. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The opposite bank was about 40 yards away at that point, a jumble of exposed roots from previous floods, fallen logs, and dense vegetation. But then I noticed a dark mass partially hidden behind a massive root wall. From my angle, I could only make out what looked like the upper portion, a head and shoulders that I initially took to be a bear. I kept fishing, working my way downstream while keeping an eye on the shape. Bears aren't uncommon here, though they typically avoid humans. But as I moved to a position more directly across from the figure, I got my first clear look and immediately knew this was no bear. The figure had dark eyes that were fixed directly on me. They weren't the small eyes of a bear, but large, round eyes set in what I can only describe as a flat, ape-like face. And there wasn't just one. As I adjusted my position, I saw a second figure standing slightly to the left of the first. I've been an outdoorsman my entire life. I know what bears look like, what elk look like, what every native animal in these woods looks like. These weren't anything I could identify. They were tall, much taller than humans, with incredibly broad shoulders and unusually long arms. They appeared to be covered in dark hair, though the one on the left had what looked like patches of bare skin on its chest. The most unnerving thing was how absolutely still they remained. No movement whatsoever, not even the slight shifting you'd see from a person trying to stand perfectly still. They were like statues, yet I could feel them watching me. I'm embarrassed to admit my first reaction wasn't to run or even to take a photo. My phone was sealed in a waterproof pouch inside my wader pocket. Instead, I just kept fishing. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, so it defaulted to the activity I was already doing. I think part of me was worried that any sudden movement might provoke whatever they were. As I continued to cast my line, trying to appear casual while stealing glances across the river, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Perched on top of the root wall was what looked like a large cocoon-shaped object. It was roughly 4 feet long and maybe 2.5 feet in diameter. The strange thing was how neatly it appeared to be wrapped in dry grasses, like cattail or pampas grass, tightly bundled and secured. My scientific mind immediately started racing with possibilities. Was it some kind of storage, a shelter, some bizarre art installation left by someone? But the isolation of this spot made that last option highly unlikely. Nobody comes here except the occasional fisherman, and I'd never seen anyone on that side of the river due to the difficult access. I continued fishing for perhaps another 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage my line. I kept stealing glances at the figures and that cocoon-like bundle. At one point, I looked directly at them for nearly 30 seconds, and they remained completely motionless, unnaturally so. The rain was coming down harder now, and I decided I should head back upstream to my car. I slowly began working my way back, keeping my movements deliberate and calm, despite the panic building inside me. When I was about halfway back to my entry point, I glanced over my shoulder to check if the figures were still there. They were gone, both of them, and the cocoon-like object was gone too. I nearly fell over in the current. The entire root wall and surrounding area was completely empty. There was no way they could have moved out of sight that quickly without me noticing, especially given the open terrain on that side. There were no large trees to hide behind, just low brush and exposed riverbank. I abandoned any pretense of fishing and made my way back to shore as quickly as the current would allow. I scrambled up the bank, pushed through the willows, and practically ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. As I sat in the driver's seat trying to calm down, I heard those bellows again. 2 of them, just like before, but this time they sounded further away. My entire body went cold. I started the car and got out of there as fast as I could on the muddy road. That night, the storms hit hard. It rained nearly 8 inches in 24 hours, and the river rose dramatically, flooding its banks. I know because I went back the next day. I couldn't help myself. I had to see that spot across the river, had to know if there was any evidence of what I'd seen. But it was impossible. The entire area was underwater. The root wall, the spot where those figures had stood, all of it was submerged under several feet of muddy, raging water. Any tracks, any evidence, anything that might have been there was long gone. I've spent months trying to rationalize what I saw. I've gone through every possible explanation, bears standing unusually, people in costumes playing an elaborate prank, some kind of rare animal that had wandered out of its typical range. But none of these explanations fit what I saw. Those eyes, the unnaturally still posture, that carefully wrapped bundle, the timing right before the flood, and those strange, haunting calls. The more I've thought about it, the more a disturbing theory has formed in my mind. What if those bellows were warnings to others? What if that cocoon-like object was some kind of burial wrapping? What if they deliberately place their dead in locations that will be carried away by rising waters, out to sea where they'll never be found? It would explain why, despite all the Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings over the years, no remains have ever been recovered. If they dispose of their dead by letting rivers carry them out to sea during floods, we'd never find remains. I know how this sounds. I'm a scientist. I deal in observable facts and reproducible results. What I experienced that day doesn't fit into my worldview, but I know what I saw, and I'm certain of one thing. Those weren't any recognized animal species, and that bundle wasn't anything made by typical human hands. I haven't been back to that fishing spot since. I keep telling myself I should go with a camera, maybe set up some trail cams in the area, but something keeps me away. Some primal instinct tells me it's better not to pursue this, better not to seek them out. Sometimes at night, when it's raining, I think I hear those bellowing calls in the distance. Probably just my imagination. Probably, but I keep my doors locked just the same. Story 6. I still don't know how to process what happened that day. It's been over 20 years, but I can remember every detail like it was yesterday. August 22nd, 1999. I know the exact date because it was the Sunday before my son Jake started 3rd grade, and I'd promised him one last adventure before summer ended. Jake was 8 at the time, a curious kid who loved being outdoors. I thought Redwood State Park would be perfect, not too far from home, beautiful scenery, and some easy hiking trails suitable for a kid. We packed some sandwiches, filled our water bottles, and headed out around noon. The drive there was uneventful. Jake was excited, bouncing in his seat as we pulled into the parking area near Burlington campgrounds around 2:30. It wasn't too crowded that day, a few families having picnics, some hikers heading out on the trails. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, with a light breeze rustling through the massive redwoods towering above us. After checking the trail map at the ranger station, we decided on Grasshopper Trail. The ranger mentioned it was a good family-friendly hike, with some minor elevation, but nothing too strenuous for a kid Jake's age. We used the restrooms, adjusted our backpacks, and set off a little before 3. The first part of the trail followed alongside a small river. Jake was having a blast, pointing out interesting rocks and asking about the different trees. The massive redwoods created this cathedral-like atmosphere. You know how it gets under those ancient trees, where the light filters down in these soft beams, and everything feels so peaceful. The forest floor was covered with ferns and fallen needles that cushioned our steps. About 15 minutes in, the trail started to wind uphill, away from the river. I'd guess we were maybe a quarter-mile up from where we'd left the water. Jake was chattering away about some video game he was into at the time. I remember feeling so content in that moment. Just me and my boy, enjoying nature together. That's when Jake stopped and said, "Wait, Dad, my shoe's untied." He knelt down to fix it, and I took the opportunity to catch my breath and look around. It's funny how life can change in just a few seconds of observation. While waiting for Jake, I was just taking in our surroundings. The trail had opened up a bit, giving us a better view of the forest ahead. The redwoods stood like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks stretching up toward the sky. I remember noticing how the afternoon sun created patches of golden light on the forest floor, contrasting with the deep shadows. My eyes were wandering across the landscape when I noticed some movement maybe 150 to 200 feet uphill from us, next to this massive old redwood stump. At first, I thought it might be another hiker who had wandered off trail, or maybe a deer or bear. You know how your brain tries to make sense of things by fitting them into familiar categories, but as I focused on that spot, something felt wrong. My eyes were adjusting to the distance and the dappled light, and I started to make out more details of what I was seeing. This wasn't a hiker, and it definitely wasn't a deer. What I saw was... I still struggled to describe it accurately. It was a large figure, easily 7 to 8 feet tall, with a distinctly human-like torso from the waist up. Its back was to us, and it appeared to be scratching itself against the redwood stump, much like how a bear might. But this was no bear. The creature's body was covered in what looked like dark reddish-brown hair or fur, not uniform in color, but somewhat patchy in places. The hair wasn't super long, but enough to cover its body completely. Its shoulders were massive, much broader than any human I've ever seen. The proportions were just off. The arms seemed longer than they should be, hanging down past where knees would be. As I stood frozen in place, the creature shifted its position slightly, and I caught a partial view of its profile. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders with little to no visible neck. The head itself was cone-shaped, coming to a somewhat rounded point at the top. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, but I could see that the face protruded forward more than a human's would. Not quite a muzzle, but definitely not a flat human face either. In those few seconds, and I swear it couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 seconds total that I was looking at this thing, I felt a cold dread wash over me that I've never experienced before or since. It was this primal, gut-level fear that bypassed all rational thought. Every instinct in my body was screaming danger in a way I can't fully explain. Jake was still tying his shoe, completely unaware of what was happening. All I could think was that I needed to get my son out of there immediately. I put my hand on his shoulder, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic surging through me. "Jake," I said as quietly as I could, while still conveying urgency, "we need to go right now. Stand up slowly, and then we're going to run back down the trail. Don't look back, just follow me." He must have heard the fear in my voice because he didn't question me, just finished his shoe quickly and stood up. I took his hand, gave one last glance toward the creature, which still hadn't appeared to notice us, and then we turned and ran. We sprinted down that trail like our lives depended on it. I was practically dragging Jake along, his shorter legs struggling to keep up with my pace. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. All I could think was, faster, faster, faster. After about 30 seconds of all-out running, which felt like forever, Jake started having trouble keeping up. I realized I might be overreacting and scaring him unnecessarily, so I slowed us down to a stop once we'd put some distance between us and whatever that was. We both stood there, gasping for breath. Jake looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. "Dad, what's happening? Why are we running?" I didn't know what to tell him. Should I be honest? Would that terrify him? Would he even believe me? I decided on a partial truth. I thought I saw something up ahead that might not be safe. I just wanted us to get back to a more open area. "Was it a bear?" he asked, his eyes growing even wider. "No, not a bear," I said truthfully. "I'm not sure what it was, but I didn't want to take any chances with you here." Jake seemed satisfied with this explanation, but I could tell he was still rattled by our sudden flight. Hell, I was more than rattled. I was absolutely shaken to my core. Standing there catching our breath, a part of me desperately wanted to go back and confirm what I'd seen. Was it really what I thought, or had my eyes and mind played some bizarre trick on me? But then I looked at Jake, my 8-year-old son who trusted me completely to keep him safe, and I knew there was no way I could risk putting him in potential danger just to satisfy my curiosity. "Are we going back to the car now?" Jake asked, sounding disappointed that our hike was being cut short. I hesitated. We were probably safe now, having put distance between us and that thing. And I didn't want to completely ruin our day out if what I'd seen was just, I don't know, some weird illusion of light and shadow. "Let's take a different trail," I suggested, trying to sound casual. "Maybe one that stays closer to the river." Jake seemed okay with this compromise, so we found a loop trail that kept us in more open areas with better visibility. But I couldn't focus on anything else for the rest of our hike. My eyes constantly scanned the forest around us. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I kept Jake close by my side the entire time. We ended up cutting our day short anyway, heading back to the car around 4:30. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I never saw anything else unusual. Jake picked up on my anxiety and was unusually quiet on the drive home. That night, after I put Jake to bed, I sat alone in my living room with a strong drink, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I've always been a practical, rational person. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or mystery creatures, but what I saw that day defied any rational explanation I could come up with. It wasn't a bear. The proportions and movements were all wrong. It wasn't a person in a costume. We were in a relatively remote part of the trail, and the size and build of the figure would have been nearly impossible to fake convincingly. The way it moved was too natural, too fluid. In the days that followed, I scoured the internet for information. This was 1999, so the internet wasn't what it is today, but I found enough to realize that what I'd seen matched descriptions of what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I'd always written those stories off as hoaxes or misidentifications, but after what I saw, I couldn't be so dismissive anymore. I considered reporting my sighting, but I kept thinking about how it would sound. Yeah, I saw a Bigfoot scratching its back on a tree stump in broad daylight. Who would believe that? I'd be labeled as a kook, a hoaxer, or someone who couldn't tell the difference between a bear and a person. So I kept it to myself. Jake never asked about what happened that day again. I think kids that age are remarkably adaptable. They accept the weird things adults do without too much question. For him, it was just a day when his dad got spooked about something and they had to run. End of story. But for me, it changed everything. I've never been able to look at forests the same way again. That feeling of being in the presence of something so utterly outside my understanding of the natural world, it stays with you. There's a certain humility that comes from realizing that maybe we don't know everything about the world we live in. I've gone back to Redwood State Park several times over the years, always alone, always hoping to catch another glimpse to validate what I saw. But there's been nothing. Just ancient trees and the usual forest inhabitants. No more mysterious figures scratching their backs on stumps. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the visceral fear I felt, the clarity with which I saw the creature's form, and I know it was real. Whatever I saw that day was as real as the ground beneath my feet. I'm sharing this now because enough time has passed that it doesn't feel so raw anymore. I can talk about it without my heart racing quite as much. And maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen something similar and will know that they're not crazy or alone in their experience. All I know for certain is that on August 22, 1999, between 3 and 4 p.m. on Grasshopper Trail in Redwood State Park, I saw something that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding of North American wildlife. And I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. Story 7. I've debated for years whether to post about this. Part of me thinks people will laugh it off, or worse, that telling it might somehow bring back what happened. But it's been over 20 years now, and I still wake up some nights hearing that snap in the darkness. It was June 2000, and I was working as a wildlife biological technician in Redwood National Park. I was 27 then, just a few years out of college with my biology degree, eager to make my mark in conservation. Spotted owl surveys were part of my seasonal work, important stuff, as their populations were crashing due to habitat loss. My partner on this particular survey was Mitch, an experienced field tech about 10 years older than me. We'd been paired together for the whole season, spending countless nights hiking remote trails, calling for owls, and documenting their responses. This was routine work for us by that point in the summer. That day started like any other survey. We loaded up our gear in the department truck around noon. The owl call speaker GPS unit, those clunky old ones from 2000, nothing like what we have now, field notebooks, and a small cage with 6 mice. The mice were used as bait to confirm owl sightings. We'd release one, and if an owl swooped down to take it, we'd have definitive proof of the species. Not the most pleasant aspect of the job, but standard protocol back then. We drove about an hour on winding roads to reach our survey point several miles south of Bald Hills Road. This was deep, deep backcountry, no cell service, no trails, nothing but ancient forest. The terrain was brutal, steep ravines, dense underbrush, fallen logs everywhere. We parked at an old logging access point and hiked another 3 hours to reach our first calling station. The survey itself went normally all afternoon. We worked our way along pre-mapped GPS points, stopping at designated locations to play recorded owl calls through a speaker, wait for responses, document findings, then move on. By around 7 p.m., we had completed most of our points and were starting the long journey back toward the truck. That's when things started feeling off. We were at nearly 2,000 feet elevation on what must have been a 3,000-foot mountain. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the massive redwoods. The coast fog was rolling in, creating that eerie, diffused light that makes the forest look both magical and menacing. We still had miles to go, all bushwhacking, no trails, to reach the truck. The mice cage was becoming a problem. We hadn't been able to clean it properly for days, and the smell was getting intense. The little guys were restless too, making more noise than usual. I remember Mitch commenting that we were basically hiking around with a dinner bell for predators. We'd been hiking downhill for about 30 minutes when I heard it, a sharp, distinct crack about 50 yards behind us. Not the subtle rustle of a squirrel or even the padded footfall of a deer. This was a substantial branch breaking under significant weight. Mitch and I both froze and exchanged glances. We'd both spent enough time in these forests to recognize wildlife sounds. Bears made certain noises. They crashed through underbrush without much concern for stealth. Mountain lions moved differently, silent, calculated, rarely breaking branches. This was neither. "What was that?" Mitch whispered. I shook my head and instinctively checked that my bear spray was accessible on my belt. Too big for a deer. We stood motionless, listening for what must have been 2 full minutes. The forest had gone unusually quiet. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering. Just the soft whisper of wind through the redwood canopy hundreds of feet above us. Eventually we started walking again, but slower now, more deliberately. I found myself constantly scanning our surroundings, the hair on my arms standing up despite the warm June evening. The mice were unusually quiet too, as if they sensed something wasn't right. About 10 minutes later, we heard movement to our left, something paralleling our course, about 60-70 yards away. The brush was too thick to see anything, but whatever it was seemed to be matching our pace. I'd tracked enough animals to know this wasn't normal wildlife behavior. "Bear?" Mitch suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe it himself. "Bears don't track people like this," I replied, "and they make more noise." What was most unsettling was how this thing moved. It seemed to be on 2 legs, not 4. It was incredibly agile for its apparent size, navigating the dense underbrush with surprising stealth. And it was fast. Sometimes it would disappear from one location only to somehow get ahead of us, or flank our position from another angle. The light was fading quickly now. Anyone who's been in an old-growth forest at dusk knows how darkness comes early under that thick canopy. We still had at least 2 hours of hiking ahead of us, and the prospect of doing it in darkness with something stalking us was making my stomach knot up. I clicked on my headlamp, and Mitch did the same. The beams seemed pathetically inadequate against the vast darkness surrounding us. Every shadow looked like it might conceal something watching us. I started checking over my shoulder every few steps. It was during one of these backward glances that I saw it. We were crossing a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, one of the few breaks in the dense forest. As I turned to look behind us, my headlamp caught movement at the edge of the trees we'd just emerged from. Something large and dark dashed across the opening, moving with shocking speed on 2 legs. I'm not easily rattled. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, even an aggressive bull elk during mating season. This was different. The way it moved. I'd seen the Patterson-Gimlin film in college, you know, that famous 1967 footage purportedly showing a female Bigfoot. What crossed our path had that same distinctive gait, that same bipedal motion. But this thing moved much quicker than Patty from the film. It was also leaner somehow, less bulky but still massive compared to a human. "Did you?" Mitch started to ask. "Yeah," I cut him off. "I saw it." We both stood rooted to the spot, our headlamps frantically scanning the tree line. The mice were going crazy now, scrambling around their cage in panic. "What do we do?" Mitch whispered. "Keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But stay close." We continued downhill, now moving as quickly as we safely could in the growing darkness. The terrain was treacherous, hidden roots, sudden drop-offs, slippery leaf litter. One wrong step could mean a broken ankle or worse, and we were miles from any help. For about 15 minutes we heard nothing. I started to hope that whatever had been following us had lost interest or moved on. Then we heard it again, a rustling in the underbrush, this time to our right and much closer than before, maybe 30 yards away. And then, unmistakably, a sound I'll never forget. A low, rumbling vocalization that was neither a growl nor exactly human. It was brief, just a few seconds, but it froze my blood. It reminded me vaguely of the infrasound that tigers can produce, something you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Mitch grabbed my arm. What the hell was that? I shook my head, unable to answer. Nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for this. We picked up our pace, almost jogging now, despite the dangerous terrain. I kept thinking about the mice. Their scent might be what had attracted this thing in the first place, but releasing them would have been against protocol, and frankly, I doubted it would make a difference at this point. The next hour passed in a blur of tension. Whatever was following us seemed to be playing some kind of game, disappearing for 10 minutes at a time, then making its presence known again with a snapped branch or rustling leaves, always from a different direction. It never showed itself fully again, just glimpses of movement caught in the periphery of our headlamp beams. At one point, Mitch thought he saw eyes reflecting back our light from a ridge above us. 2 yellowish-green orbs about 7 feet off the ground that blinked once, then vanished. What struck me most was the intelligence behind the behavior. This wasn't a predator simply stalking prey. It felt deliberate, curious, almost playful in a disturbing way, like a cat toying with mice, except we were the mice. The impression I couldn't shake was that we had encountered something like a curious, somewhat immature Sasquatch, a teenager maybe, shadowing us through the forest more out of fascination than hunger. The most terrifying moment came when we were about an hour from the truck. We'd been hiking in tense silence, both of us jumping at every natural forest sound. I stopped to check our GPS position, and Mitch walked a few paces ahead. Suddenly, I felt it, an unmistakable presence directly behind me, close, too close. The air seemed to change, becoming warmer, and I caught a musky animal smell that overpowered even the mice cage stench. Every instinct screamed danger. I couldn't move, couldn't turn around, couldn't call out to Mitch. It was as if my body understood that any sudden movement might trigger something terrible. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, I stood perfectly still, feeling something breathing close enough that the small hairs on my neck stirred with each exhalation. Then Mitch called from ahead, "Tom, you coming?" The presence vanished instantly. No sound of retreat, no rustling brush. It was simply gone. When I finally managed to turn around, shaking uncontrollably, there was nothing there. Just darkness between the ancient trees. We made it back to the truck without further incident, though we both felt watched until the moment we slammed the doors shut and started the engine. The drive back to headquarters was silent. What could we possibly say? We logged our owl survey data as required, but mentioned nothing about our encounter in the official report. Who would believe us? What would it accomplish besides potentially damaging our professional reputations? Mitch and I never directly discussed what happened that night. The next morning, he requested reassignment to a different survey area, citing personal reasons. I continued working in Redwood National Park for another month before my seasonal position ended, but I never went back to that particular section again. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was an unusually bold bear. Maybe the isolation and growing darkness played tricks on our senses. But deep down, I know what I saw crossing that clearing. Something moving on 2 legs that shouldn't exist according to science. I still work in wildlife biology, though I've moved to more administrative roles that keep me out of remote backcountry. I've never told this story to colleagues, but sometimes when we're discussing species yet to be discovered or the vast unknowns of our wilderness areas, I think about that June evening in 2000 and wonder what exactly was studying us as we studied the forest. I don't have answers. All I know is that sometimes, in my dreams, I'm still standing there feeling hot breath on my neck and knowing that if I turn around, I'll finally see what was following us through the ancient redwoods. Story 8. I've been holding this in for over 20 years now. I've only told a few close friends and family, but I think it's time to share what happened to me. I'm not looking for fame or attention. I just need to get this off my chest and maybe find others who've experienced something similar. I was working as a forest ranger in Northern California back in 2000. I loved my job. Being outdoors, helping preserve nature, educating visitors. It was exactly what I wanted to do with my life. Most days were pretty routine. Trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, helping lost hikers. But June 25th, 2000 changed everything for me. The date is burned into my memory because I've replayed what happened countless times, trying to make sense of it. That Sunday evening, I was finishing up some work at a ranch off Johnson's Creek Road. It was a beautiful area tucked away in the forest, about 2 miles from where it connects with Bald Hills Road. The owners had reported some unusual wildlife activity, so I went out to check things out and file a report. Nothing serious, just some displaced deer patterns they were concerned about. I wrapped up around 6:09 p.m. and started my drive back to the ranger station. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, about 70 degrees, with that golden early evening sunlight filtering through the trees. You know, that kind of light that makes everything look magical. The forest was quiet, except for the usual bird calls and the sound of my truck tires on the gravel road. I had the windows down, enjoying the fresh air after a long day. I remember checking my watch. It was exactly 6:10 p.m. I always had this habit of checking the time when I was driving alone, especially in remote areas. Sort of a safety thing, I guess. I was driving slowly, maybe 25 mph because the road was pretty rough in spots. That's when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from the trees moving in the wind, but something about it made me slow down even more. To my right, maybe 50 yards into the forest, I saw movement. Not random movement, but purposeful. My first thought was deer, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. The movement was too tall, too vertical. I eased up on the gas pedal without fully stopping. Ranger instinct, I guess. You don't want to spook wildlife, but you also want to observe. As my truck slowed, I got a clearer view of what was moving through the trees. What I saw next still gives me chills. It was a figure, large, way larger than any human I'd ever seen. It was striding through the forest at an incredible pace, moving away from the road. The strides were long, fluid, and powerful. Not running exactly, but covering ground with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. The sunlight was filtering through the trees at that perfect angle, illuminating parts of the figure as it moved between patches of shade and light. Its body looked, I don't even know how to describe it properly, a brown and golden hue against the darker green of the forest. Not wearing clothes, but covered in something, hair or fur that caught the light in a way that human clothing wouldn't. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles went white. I wasn't scared exactly, more like in shock. My brain was trying to categorize what I was seeing, but nothing fit. Bear. No way. Too tall, moving on 2 legs with perfect balance. Hiker. Impossible. No human could move that fast through dense forest without tripping. Plus, the proportions were all wrong. The figure seemed aware of my presence. It never looked directly at me, but its pace increased as my truck slowed down. Then, in a movement that defies explanation, it reached what looked like an embankment, a steep drop-off about 30-40 feet high, and without hesitation it just jumped. Not fell, not climbed down, but propelled itself off the edge in one fluid motion. I actually gasped out loud. My foot hit the brake reflexively, bringing my truck to a sudden stop. A cloud of dust rose from where the figure had launched itself, hanging in the air like a marker of what had just happened. The silence that followed was deafening. No crashing sounds, no indication of a hard landing, just silence, I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to grab my gear and investigate, but another part, the part that was suddenly aware of how alone I was, said, "Keep driving." I chose to keep driving. As I accelerated, I couldn't stop looking in my rearview mirror at that dust cloud slowly dissipating in the evening air. About a quarter-mile further, the road opened up into prairie land, and the dense forest gave way to open fields. The contrast was jarring, like stepping out of a dream into reality. My training kicked in. I started mentally recording details: approximate height, at least 7 to 8 feet, gait, bipedal, fluid, coloration, brown, golden, speed, faster than any human could move through dense forest. The ranger in me was trying to categorize, to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and wrote everything down in my notebook: date, time, location, conditions, every detail I could remember. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely write. I remember drawing a rough sketch of the figure's outline and then immediately ripping it out of my notebook because it looked so absurd on paper. I didn't report it officially. What would I say? That I saw a giant, hairy humanoid running through the forest? In ranger circles, that's career suicide. Instead, I drove back to my cabin and called my buddy Mike, another ranger who I trusted. He listened without interrupting, then asked if I'd been drinking. I hadn't touched alcohol in weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The way it moved was what stuck with me most. So fast, so powerful, yet completely in control. No human moves like that. No animal I know moves like that either. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a bear standing on its hind legs, maybe startled by my truck. But bears don't walk or run distances on 2 legs. They certainly don't leap off embankments with the grace this thing had. I drove back to the spot early the next day, before my shift. The morning dew was still clinging to everything, making the forest glisten. I found the embankment easily enough. It was about 35 feet high, ending in a rocky creek bed below. I searched for tracks, for hair caught on branches, for any evidence. Nothing. The ground was too dry and hard for prints, and if there had been any other signs, the light morning rain had washed them away. As the days passed, I found myself becoming obsessed with that stretch of forest. I volunteered for patrols in that area, spent my off days hiking nearby trails, and researched local folklore. I found some old newspaper clippings about similar sightings in the area dating back to the 1960s. Locals called it different names, but the descriptions were eerily similar. I changed after that day, became more alert, more aware of my surroundings in the forest. Some might say paranoid. I started carrying a camera everywhere, hoping to capture evidence if I ever saw it again. I never did. Other rangers noticed the change in me. My supervisor asked if everything was okay at home. I said yes, just some personal stuff. How do you tell your boss you're distracted because you saw something that shouldn't exist? About a month later, I was doing maintenance on a trail about 5 miles from the sighting location when I found something strange. A clump of hair caught on a broken branch about 8 feet off the ground. Too high for a deer, wrong color for a bear. I put it in a plastic bag and later sent it to a friend who worked in a university biology lab. The results came back inconclusive. Unidentified primate hair, possibly contaminated sample. When I pressed for more information, my friend stopped returning my calls. 6 months after the sighting, I transferred to a different district. I told myself it was for career advancement, but the truth is, I couldn't keep working in those woods without constantly looking over my shoulder. I needed a fresh start somewhere the forests didn't feel like they were hiding secrets. It's been over 2 decades now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I almost convince myself it didn't happen, that maybe it was just a strange light effect or my eyes playing tricks on me. But then I remember the dust cloud, the impossible leap, the fluid movement through dense underbrush. No light trick could create that. I've read about similar encounters over the years. Some people call what they saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what label to put on what I saw. All I know is that for a few seconds on a summer evening in Northern California, I witnessed something that doesn't fit into our understanding of what lives in North American forests. The logical part of my brain still tries to find explanations. Could it have been another ranger in some kind of ghillie suit, playing a prank? No way. The movement was too fluid, too fast, and no human could have made that jump without serious injury. A bear? The height and bipedal movement rule that out? Some undiscovered species? Maybe. But how could something that large remain largely undocumented in such a relatively populated state? I don't talk about this much these days. My wife knows, and she believes I saw something, even if we don't know what it was. Most other people just give me that look, you know the one, like I'm either lying or crazy, so I've kept it mostly to myself. But I know what I saw. It was real. It was there. And sometimes, when I'm hiking in the woods and the light filters through the trees in that specific way, casting golden brown hues across the forest floor, I find myself scanning the tree line, half hoping, half fearing I'll see that figure again, moving with impossible speed and grace through a world that insists it doesn't exist. I still have the notebook with my observations from that day. Sometimes I read through my notes, trying to make sense of it all. But after 23 years, I'm no closer to understanding what I encountered on that road than I was at 6:10 p.m. on June 25th, 2000. Story 9. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family, but what happened to me back in 2000 has stuck with me for over 20 years now. I'm still trying to make sense of it. It was July 13th, 2000. I remember the exact date because we had just celebrated my cousin's birthday the day before, and we were heading back home from Eureka to Crescent City. It was me, my boyfriend Matt, and our 2-month-old baby Lily in her car seat. The drive along Highway 101 through the redwoods is gorgeous, but can feel endless when you're traveling with a newborn. We'd left Eureka around 6 p.m. after visiting Matt's parents. The weather was perfect, one of those clear summer evenings when the sun is still pretty high, but starting to cast longer shadows through the trees. Lily had been fussy earlier, but finally fell asleep in the car, so we were both feeling relieved and enjoying the peaceful drive. We'd just passed through Auric, that tiny town with the palm trees that seemed so out of place among the redwoods. Matt was driving our old Honda Civic, while I was sitting in the passenger seat, half watching the scenery and half keeping an eye on Lily in the back. The radio was playing quietly. I think it was Dave Matthews or something similar, and we were talking about the most mundane stuff, like what we needed from the grocery store when we got back. It was about 7:15 p.m. when it happened. I remember checking the clock on the dashboard because Lily would need to be fed soon. We were coming around this bend in the road, just before you get to the lagoon area. It's a 4-lane section of the highway there, 2 lanes in each direction, and the road curves just enough that you can't see very far ahead. There wasn't much traffic. I think we'd passed maybe 2 cars in the last 10 minutes. As we came around the bend, I saw something that made me sit up straight in my seat. About 50 yards ahead, this figure was crossing the road from the east side to the west side. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person. You know how your mind immediately tries to fit what you're seeing into something familiar? But within seconds, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't human. Not at all. It was tall. I'm terrible with estimating heights, but it had to be at least 7 or 8 feet. The thing that struck me most was its color. This dark brown that almost looked black in the evening light. It was covered in hair, not like fur exactly, but long hair that moved slightly as it ran. And it was running. Not like a person jogging, but taking these full, powerful strides across the highway. Its arms were hanging down, and they seemed unusually long, almost out of proportion to its body. Its neck was kind of hunched over, not straight up like a person would stand. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 5 or 6 seconds. It crossed both lanes heading into our direction, and then the 2 lanes on the other side before disappearing into the tree line. Matt had to brake a bit as we approached where it had crossed, but we weren't really in danger of hitting it. I remember feeling like my heart stopped for a second, and then I blurted out, "That was a Bigfoot." I didn't even think before I said it. The words just came out of my mouth. Matt looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What? Come on, Jess," he laughed. "Don't joke around." "I'm not joking," I insisted, twisting in my seat to look back through the rear window, even though we'd already passed the spot. "I swear to God, Matt, that wasn't a person, that wasn't an animal, that was something else." I could tell he thought I was messing with him. Matt's always been the skeptical type, the kind of guy who needs proof for everything. But I kept insisting, getting more worked up by the second, pointing back toward where we'd seen it. "Fine," he finally said, and he slowed down, pulled into a small turnout about a quarter-mile down the road, and turned the car around. I think he was just humoring me, expecting to prove I was seeing things. We drove back to the spot where the creature had disappeared into the forest. Matt pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, and we both peered out of the windows into the woods. The trees were thick there, redwoods mixed with other conifers and underbrush. The late evening sun was filtering through in patches, creating this mixture of golden light and deep shadows. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe the creature standing there watching us. But there was nothing visible from the road, just trees and shadows and the normal sounds of the forest. But something felt wrong. As we sat there, I started feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The forest that had seemed so beautiful just minutes ago now felt threatening. I got this crawling sensation on the back of my neck like we were being watched. The hair on my arm stood up, and I felt cold despite the warm evening. "Matt, let's go," I said, my voice coming out much quieter than I'd intended. "I don't like this." He was squinting into the woods, trying to see something, anything. "What exactly did you think you saw?" he asked, still skeptical but maybe a little less sure of himself now. "I told you, it was... I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a person, and it wasn't a bear." I was getting antsy, reaching back to check on Lily, who was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of what her mom had just seen. "Please, can we just go?" Lily chose that moment to start stirring, making those little noises babies make just before they fully wake up and start crying. That seemed to settle it for Matt. He put the car in drive, and we pulled back onto the highway, continuing toward Crescent City. As we drove, I kept replaying the sighting in my head, trying to make sense of it. One thing that struck me as strange was how deliberate the creature's movements had been. It hadn't just randomly wandered onto the highway. It had chosen that spot, a relatively flat section without hills directly alongside the road, and a place where the trees came pretty close to the pavement on both sides, meaning it wouldn't be exposed for long. And the timing. There were no other cars around at that moment. It was like it had been waiting for a gap in traffic to cross, only it hadn't anticipated our car coming around the bend right then. I tried explaining this to Matt as we drove, and he listened more seriously this time. "Are you absolutely sure it wasn't a bear?" he asked. "Bears can look pretty weird when they stand up or run." "Matt, I know what a bear looks like," I said, getting frustrated. "This wasn't moving like a bear. It was running on 2 legs the entire time, moving way faster than a bear could on its hind legs, and the proportions were all wrong for a bear. Its arms, or front legs if it was a bear, were hanging down by its sides as it ran, not being used for support at all." I could tell he was starting to at least consider the possibility that I'd seen something unusual, even if he wasn't ready to call it a Bigfoot. We drove the rest of the way home, mostly in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Lily woke up fully about 20 minutes later, and the normal routine of caring for her provided a welcome distraction. When we got home, Matt told me not to mention what I'd seen to anyone. "People will think you're crazy," he said. It stung a little, but I knew he was probably right. Northern California has its fair share of Bigfoot stories, and I didn't want to become that woman who claims she saw Sasquatch on Highway 101. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I found myself researching Bigfoot sightings in Humboldt County, looking for stories similar to mine. There were quite a few, actually many, from the same general area where we'd been driving. The descriptions matched what I'd seen: tall, dark-haired, bipedal creatures moving with surprising speed through the forest. About a week later, we were having dinner with Matt's sister and her husband, and somehow the conversation turned to wildlife in the area. Matt's brother-in-law mentioned seeing a bear near his property in Trinidad, and Matt gave me this look, like, "Don't you dare bring it up." But his sister caught the look and asked what was going on. Before Matt could stop me, I told them about what I'd seen. I tried to be matter-of-fact about it, just describing what I observed without labeling it. But as soon as I finished, Matt's brother-in-law said, "So, you think you saw Bigfoot?" "I don't know what I saw," I replied honestly. "I'm just telling you what it looked like." "Could have been a bear," he suggested, just like Matt had. "They can look pretty strange sometimes, especially in the evening light." I shook my head. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "The way it moved was all wrong. It was running upright the entire time, fast, with a stride like a person but longer. Bears don't move like that. They exchange those looks people give when they think someone's being irrational, but they're too polite to say so." The conversation moved on, and I didn't bring it up again that night. Over the years, I've mentioned the experience to a few other people, always getting similar reactions. Some people seem intrigued but skeptical. Others clearly think I was seeing things or exaggerating. A few believe me completely and share their own strange stories. Matt and I eventually separated when Lily was 4, for reasons completely unrelated to my Bigfoot sighting, I should add. But before we split, he did admit to me one night, after a few beers, that he'd sometimes wondered if maybe I had seen something unusual that day. "The way you described it never changed," he said. "Most people embellish stories over time, but your details stayed consistent." That meant a lot to me, actually, because I know what I saw. Even now, 23 years later, I can close my eyes and see that dark figure crossing the road with those powerful strides. I can feel that same chill I felt when we stopped the car and looked into the woods. I've driven that stretch of highway dozens of times since then, often slowing down around that same curve, scanning the tree line. I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, a brief moment when whatever lives in those ancient forests let itself be seen, if only for a few seconds. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever name you want to give it. I just know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I recognized. And sometimes, when I'm hiking in the redwoods with friends or family, I get that same feeling I had that day, that crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like something's watching from just behind the trees. And I remember to keep my eyes open when I round the next bend in the trail. Story 10. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in May 2001. It's been over 20 years now, but I can close my eyes and be right back there, sitting in my truck at the edge of that clearcut, hearing those sounds in the darkness and feeling completely exposed. I've been a sound researcher for years, specializing in wildlife audio recordings and acoustic analysis. My name's John, and I've spent countless nights in remote locations setting up equipment, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on May 26, 2001. My team and I had planned this trip to Humboldt County for months. There had been some interesting reports from the area, unusual vocalizations around Johnson and the Klamath River that didn't match known wildlife. I brought along 3 team members, Manny, who'd been working with me for about 5 years, and 2 newer guys, Dave and Chris, who had military backgrounds and experience with night observation equipment. We arrived midday on Saturday and spent the afternoon scouting the perfect location. We found a recent clear-cut area about 1,500 feet above the river and the town of Johnson. It was ideal, approximately 1,000 feet wide and 1,200 feet long, with excellent sound projection across the valley. Plus, we had good elevation changes to position lookouts. I set Dave and Chris at the top of the clear-cut, about 150 feet higher than our base camp and roughly 300 feet away. They had night vision scopes and 2-way radios. I remember thinking how professional our setup looked, Manny handling the recording equipment at base camp while I prepared for a scheduled live radio interview with Jeff Wren's program at 10 p.m. I'd been on his show several times before, discussing my wildlife sound research. Around sunset, I tested my sound equipment, a powerful system that could project recorded wildlife calls across the valley. The acoustics were perfect. The clear cut created this natural amphitheater effect, and sounds carried incredibly well. I played a few test recordings, and the echoes bouncing back were crisp and clear. Cell reception at the base camp was spotty, so I told Manny I'd drive my truck about 600 feet toward the tree line during the commercial breaks of the radio program to maintain a better connection for my interview. In hindsight, that decision changed everything. Night fell quickly. That's something about the forest. 1 minute you have twilight, and the next it's pitch black. We had a quarter moon, so there was minimal light. I remember checking my watch repeatedly as 10 p.m. approached. I was nervous about the interview, not because of the content, but because of the reception issues. At 9:55, I gathered my satellite phone, notes, and a flashlight. I remember Manny asking if I wanted to take my revolver or the night vision camera, but I brushed him off. "I'll only be gone for an hour at most, just moving between spots for better reception," I told him. "Keep an eye on the equipment here." That's a decision I've replayed in my mind countless times since. I drove my truck to the spot I'd picked out earlier, about 600 feet from base camp and maybe 15 feet from the tree line. Dense forest behind me, open clear-cut in front. I positioned the truck so my headlights faced the open area, then turned the engine off, but left the battery on so I could use the dome light to read my notes. The radio show started right on time. Jeff introduced me, and we began discussing my research. About 15 minutes in, during a back and forth about different vocalization patterns, I heard something. At first, it was just a crack, the kind of sound a branch makes when something heavy steps on it. I dismissed it initially. Forests make noises at night. But then I heard it again, and again. It had a pattern to it. Not random forest noises, but deliberate movement. Something was walking through the brush behind my truck. I keyed my handheld radio during a commercial break. "Dave, Chris, you guys see anything near my position? I'm hearing movement in the trees behind me." "Negative," came Dave's response. "All clear from our vantage point." The radio show resumed, and I tried to focus on Jeff's questions, but the sounds grew more distinct. Whatever was moving through the brush was large, much larger than a deer or coyote. The footfalls were heavy, and I could hear vegetation being pushed aside. Then the movement pattern changed. It wasn't just walking anymore. It sounded like charging, followed by stopping, then more movement. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the satellite phone would pick it up. During the next break, I radioed again. "Guys, I'm definitely hearing something large moving around behind me in the forest. Can you sweep that area with your scopes?" "We're looking, John," Chris responded. "Nothing visible from our angle yet." I switched back to the interview, trying to sound normal while adrenaline flooded my system. The charging sounds continued, getting closer each time. It would rush forward, stop, then there would be silence for 30 seconds or so before another rush. It was like whatever was out there was gaining confidence with each approach. The next time I radioed the lookout team, my voice wasn't steady anymore. "Guys, this thing is getting closer. I'm not armed, and I'm sitting in a vehicle with no real protection. Please tell me you see something." Silence for maybe 5 seconds, then my radio crackled. Dave's voice came through, but different now, tense, almost whispering. "John, it's looking right at you. Can't you see it? It's about 25 feet away. It's huge." My body went cold. I was still on the live radio show, so I couldn't just react. I remember mumbling something to Jeff about unusual nighttime activity while trying to process what Dave had just told me. "What do you mean, it? What are you seeing?" I whispered into the radio during a moment when Jeff was talking. "Some kind of bipedal figure," came the response. "Massive shoulders, like 4 feet across. We estimate it's about 8 feet tall. It's just standing there at the tree line watching you." I've never felt more exposed than in that moment. The dome light was on. I was clearly visible but could see nothing outside the small illuminated area of my truck. I was trapped in a bubble of light with something enormous watching me from the darkness. I managed to finish the radio interview on autopilot. I don't remember what I said or how I sounded, but Jeff later told me I seemed distracted but professional. Inside, I was having a complete meltdown. For nearly 30 minutes, according to Dave and Chris, this creature observed me. Sometimes it would move laterally, side to side, as if trying to get a better view through the vegetation. Other times, it would make quick arm movements that the guys thought looked like signals to others that might have been nearby. The radio show ended at 11 p.m. I should have been relieved, but now I had to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just drive away and leave Manny at the base camp, but I also couldn't sit there all night being watched. "Is it still there?" I whispered into the radio. "Affirmative," Chris replied. "It hasn't moved much. Wait, it's backing up a bit now." I considered my options. The base camp was about 600 feet away across open ground. I could drive there quickly enough, but what if there were more of these things in the forest edge surrounding the clear cut? "Guys, I'm going to slowly drive back to base camp. Keep your eyes on this thing, and you look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't even find the words at first. I just grabbed my revolver from the equipment case and stood there, scanning the tree line. Dave and Chris radioed that they were coming down, and within minutes, the 4 of us were huddled at the base camp, speaking in hushed tones. Dave described what they'd seen in detail. An enormous bipedal figure with a distinctive silhouette that matched nothing he'd ever seen before or since. Not a bear, not a person in a suit, something else entirely. He estimated its height at 8 to 9 feet, based on comparing it to trees they knew the height of. The shoulders were disproportionately broad, and the head appeared to sit directly on those shoulders, with little or no neck visible. We stayed awake all night, taking shifts to watch the perimeter of our camp. None of us slept. We heard occasional movement in the forest, branches breaking, vegetation rustling, but never saw anything clearly. At first light, we cautiously investigated the area where the creature had been standing. The soil was too compacted from logging equipment to show clear footprints, but we found broken branches at heights that confirmed the size Dave and Chris had reported. Some vegetation was pushed aside in a way that suggested something large had moved through recently. What strikes me most, looking back, is the intelligence behind those movements. The way it would charge forward, stop, retreat, and then approach again. Testing boundaries, assessing the situation, the arm movements that seemed like communication signals, the way it positioned itself to observe me while remaining mostly concealed. We packed up early and left that day. I've never been back to that specific location, though I've continued my research in other areas. For years, I hesitated to talk about what happened. In scientific circles, discussing Sasquatch encounters is career suicide. But I know what Dave and Chris saw that night, and I know what I heard. The most unsettling part, that feeling of being watched by something that understood exactly what it was doing. This wasn't a random animal encounter. It was a deliberate interaction. It knew I was there, isolated, and it chose to make its presence known. Why it didn't approach further, I'll never know. I still do sound research, but never alone anymore, and never without proper safety measures. Sometimes when I'm setting up equipment in remote locations, I'll get that same feeling, the heavy silence, the sense of being observed. And I'll wonder if there's something just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting. That night changed everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. There are things in the forests that haven't been properly documented, things that are far more intelligent and evasive than science currently acknowledges. I don't know what to call what we encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it was watching me. I still have the audio recording of that radio interview. Sometimes I listen to it and hear the tension in my voice, the moments where I pause a beat too long because I'm listening to something moving in the darkness. But the recording doesn't capture what was happening just outside my truck, what was staring at me from 25 feet away, while I sat there completely vulnerable and unaware. Whatever it was, it could have easily reached my truck in seconds. Why it chose to just watch instead is a question that keeps me up at night, even after all these years. Story 11. I've never really told this story in full detail before. A few buddies know bits and pieces, but I've mostly kept it to myself because, well, you know how people get when you start talking about this stuff. But it's been eating at me for years now, and I need to get it off my chest. This happened back in 2002 when I was stationed at Beal Air Force Base in California. I'm originally from Alabama, and I'd been in the Air Force for about 6 years at that point. Growing up in the South, I spent most of my childhood hunting, fishing, and exploring the woods with my dad and uncles. I know wildlife. I know what a bear looks like, what a deer moves like. Hell, I could identify most animals by their tracks by the time I was 12. California was a whole different world for me. The landscape, the wildlife, everything was new. One weekend in late September, I had a 3-day pass and decided to explore Humboldt Redwood State Park. I'd heard about these massive trees my whole life, and I figured I'd check them out while also scouting for fishing spots. I left base early that Saturday morning in my Chevy Z71, packed with some basic camping gear, my fishing stuff, and enough supplies for the day. The drive was long but beautiful, especially as I got closer to the coast. I remember pulling off Highway 101 onto the Avenue of the Giants and just being awestruck. These trees were like nothing I'd ever seen, so massive they made you feel like an ant. I drove slowly, windows down, taking it all in. The air smelled different there, earthy, damp, ancient somehow. I was keeping an eye out for access points to the river since I'd heard the fishing was decent. I passed a few turnouts but kept going, thinking I'd find a less crowded spot further down. After driving for maybe an hour, I noticed the river was starting to recede from view. I figured I'd gone far enough and was about to find a place to turn around when it happened. Something, and I still struggle with what to call it, stepped out from the tree line on the right side of the road about 50 yards ahead of me. I hit the brakes hard enough that my tackle box slid off the passenger seat. My truck skidded a little before coming to a stop. What I saw, man, it's still so vivid in my mind. This thing was massive. Standing upright on 2 legs, it had to be over 7 feet tall. I'm 6'0" and weigh about 220, and this thing would have dwarfed me. I'd estimate it was around 350 pounds of solid mass. It walked, not shuffled, not ambled, but walked directly across the road. The stride was long and deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. What struck me most was its back, incredibly broad and muscular. Its arms were proportionally long, hanging lower than a human's would. And its head, it was like it had virtually no neck. The trapezius muscles were so pronounced that its head just seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. The whole thing was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, longer in some places than others, especially around the shoulders. It never turned around, never acknowledged me, just crossed the road in about 4 or 5 strides and disappeared into the trees on the other side. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10-15 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'm not a guy who scares easily. I've been deployed to some sketchy places. But this shook me. After a few minutes, I pulled myself together. The logical part of my brain was trying to categorize what I'd seen. Bear? No way. Wrong proportions, wrong movement. Some guy in a costume? Out here, miles from any trailhead? Highly unlikely. I decided to investigate. I drove to where the thing had crossed and pulled over to the side of the road. I grabbed my knife from the glove compartment. Not that it would have done much good against something that size, but it made me feel better. The ground was fairly soft from recent rain, and I found a couple of partial tracks where it had stepped onto the road. They were huge. I'd estimate 14-15 inches long. The stride length was what really got me. I tried to match it, stretching my legs as far as I could, and I couldn't come close without jumping from spot to spot. I didn't venture into the woods. Something primal told me that was a bad idea. I took a few deep breaths, got back in my truck, and continued driving until I found a place to turn around. As I passed the spot again, I slowed down and looked into the woods but saw nothing. The rest of that day I felt on edge. I still went fishing at a spot I found a few miles back, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest that had seemed so majestic earlier now felt oppressive, like something was watching me from between those ancient trees. I told myself I'd seen a bear, maybe walking oddly on its hind legs. But I knew better. I'd seen plenty of bears in my life, and this wasn't one. I almost convinced myself to forget about it, almost, but then spring 2003 rolled around, and I found myself drawn back to that area. I had another long weekend and decided to return to Humboldt. I told myself it was for the fishing, but honestly, I wanted answers. This time, I went prepared. I had my fishing gear, but also a small backpack with water, energy bars, a compass, and a handheld GPS unit, new technology back then. What I didn't bring was a gun, or even bear spray. In retrospect, that was pretty stupid, but I wasn't thinking clearly. Part of me didn't want to admit I was actually looking for whatever I'd seen before. I parked at a designated fishing access point and hiked along the river. It was a beautiful day, clear blue sky, temperature in the low 70s. Perfect. The river was running clear, and I spotted a few good fishing holes. But I kept going, drawn further downstream. After about 2 miles of hiking, the terrain got rougher, the path narrowed, and in some places I had to navigate around fallen trees or scramble over rocks. The fishing rod in my hand started to feel like a pretense. I wasn't really there to fish anymore. I came around a bend in the river and stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw what looked like a stump on the opposite bank, maybe 200 yards away. I didn't think much of it at first, just another piece of the landscape, but something about it caught my attention. The color seemed off for a stump, more reddish than the weathered gray of dead wood. I moved closer, working my way along the riverbank, trying to be quiet. As I got within about 100 yards, I realized the stump was oddly shaped. I froze when it occurred to me what I might be looking at. Sure enough, as I stood there watching, the stump moved. It stood up, and I felt my blood run cold. This was the same type of creature I'd seen crossing the road the year before, but even bigger. Standing fully upright, it had to be at least 7'6" tall, maybe taller. Heavier too. I'd guess over 400 pounds. The proportions were the same, that broad back, the long arms that hung down to its knees, the absence of a neck. It stood there, seemingly unaware of me at first. I was downwind, which might explain why it hadn't picked up my scent. I was completely exposed on the riverbank, no trees or rocks to hide behind. My only movement was my chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I'll never forget that moment. We locked eyes across about 75 yards of river and rocky shore. Its face was not what I expected. More human-like than ape, but not human. The brow was heavy, the nose flat and wide. I couldn't make out many details at that distance, but the eyes, they were dark, alert, intelligent. For about 10 seconds we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. My fishing rod hung uselessly at my side. I wasn't scared exactly, more like awestruck, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. Something must have spooked it. Maybe a noise I didn't hear, or it finally caught my scent. Without warning, it turned and moved away from me, downstream along the bank. The speed was shocking. This massive creature moved through difficult terrain with an agility that defied its size. It wasn't running in panic. It was more like it had decided our encounter was over, and it was leaving. Within seconds, it had covered ground that would have taken me minutes to navigate, disappearing around a bend in the river. I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity. My legs were shaking, my mouth was bone dry. The fishing rod in my hand suddenly felt ridiculous, like bringing a toothpick to a gunfight. When I finally got my wits about me, I did the only sensible thing. I got the hell out of there. Not running, but moving steadily, constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to my truck, which had taken me over an hour on the way in, seemed to pass in a blur. Back at my truck, I sat with the engine running for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I'm a rational guy. I don't believe in monsters or myths. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that specific spot again. I finished my tour at Beal the following year and transferred to another base. But those encounters have stayed with me. I've read books, watched documentaries, compared notes with other stories online. I know what people would call what I saw. But putting that label on it feels like cheapening the experience somehow. What strikes me most, looking back, is the lack of aggression. Both times, these creatures showed no interest in confrontation. The first one ignored me completely. The second chose to leave rather than engage. These weren't monsters. They were animals, or something else, going about their business in their territory. I still fish, I still hike, but I'm more aware now of how little we actually know about the wilderness around us. Those ancient redwood forests have stood for thousands of years. Is it so hard to believe they might harbor secrets we haven't discovered? I don't know what I saw in those woods. I can describe it, but I can't explain it. And to this day, whenever I hear stories of strange encounters in remote forests, I don't laugh or scoff. I just remember those eyes looking at me across the river, intelligent and aware, before their owner decided our paths should not cross again. Story 12. I still don't know what we saw that day. It's been over 20 years, and I've barely told anyone about it. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this is the right place for it. This happened on October 21st, 2000. I remember the date exactly because it was the weekend before my son turned 3, and we were driving back from visiting my mom in Oregon. I'm from the Bay Area originally, and when my mom retired, she moved up north to this little place outside Portland. It's beautiful up there, but the drive is brutal, especially with a toddler. My son was fast asleep in his car seat. He'd been fussy earlier that morning when we left Mom's place, but the motion of the car always knocked him right out. I remember being grateful for the quiet, just me and the radio playing softly with the windows cracked. It was a gorgeous fall day, clear blue skies, perfect visibility, around 10:30 in the morning. I was on Highway 101 heading south, just past Oric, California. If you've never been there, it's this tiny town nestled between redwood forests and the Pacific. There's not much to it, a couple gas stations, a few houses, and miles of stunning coastline. The highway runs parallel to these lagoons in some parts, and the water gets this glass-like quality when it's calm. So I'm driving along, sipping my coffee, already thinking about getting home and unpacking all our stuff. Then I notice what I assume are two fishermen in the water, maybe 100 yards ahead of me. It wasn't unusual to see people fishing there, even though the water isn't super deep. One guy was standing in profile to the highway, and the other seemed to be sitting partially in the water with one knee sticking up. Nothing weird about that at first glance. But as I got closer, maybe around 60 yards away, something started feeling off. The standing figure was covered in what looked like fur, not a jacket or clothing. Actual fur. Long, deep brown with these auburn highlights, and it was wet, clinging to whatever was underneath, and the size... This thing was massive. I'm talking 7 to 8 feet tall at minimum, with this incredibly muscular build, way bigger than any human I've ever seen. I instinctively eased off the gas pedal without even thinking about it. My car slowed to maybe 10-20 mph as I tried to process what I was seeing. My heart started racing, but there was this weird calm about me too, like my brain was trying to make sense of something it had no context for. The seated one was doing something with its hands in the water, like it was searching for something beneath the surface. The standing one was slowly walking toward the shore with this bizarre gait. Its arms swung in these exaggerated arcs, almost like the arm motion was propelling it forward rather than its legs. It wasn't normal walking. The movements were fluid, but wrong somehow. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. By this point, I was close enough, maybe 40 feet away, that I could see details I wish I couldn't. The standing creature had these unnaturally large, rounded shoulders. Its head was oval-shaped, sitting directly on those shoulders with barely any neck visible. The weirdest part was its hair. Despite being wet, it looked almost groomed, not matted or tangled like you'd expect on a wild animal. And its face... God, I still see that face sometimes when I close my eyes. It was this dark cream color, completely hairless, with fine light brown hair framing it. The nose was flat, but slightly rounded, not protruding much. And the eyes... The eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all, just these glossy black orbs that didn't seem to blink. What freaks me out the most, looking back, is how they completely ignored me. Here I am, rolling by in a silver Honda maybe 40 feet away, and neither of them even acknowledged my presence. The one I could see clearly never once looked in my direction. It's like I wasn't even there, or like my presence was so insignificant they didn't care. I don't know which possibility is worse. By this point, my son was still asleep in the back, completely oblivious. I had this moment of pure, primal fear, not just for myself, but for him. What if I stopped? What if they noticed us? I hit the gas and sped away, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified they might be following us somehow, but the road curved and they disappeared from view. I didn't stop driving until I hit Arcata, and even then I only pulled over long enough to get gas because I had to. The attendant asked if I was okay, and I mumbled something about being tired from the drive. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking I'd dreamed it. Or maybe I'd seen some hunters in weird gear, or surfers in some kind of specialty wetsuits. But I know what I saw. It was broad daylight on a clear morning. I wasn't tired, I wasn't drunk, I wasn't on medication. I was just a mom driving her kid home from grandma's house. I tried researching it later. This was back before smartphones, so I had to wait until I got home to get on our dial-up internet. I spent hours on these cryptozoology forums and Bigfoot websites. Most of the descriptions didn't match what I saw. These things weren't hairy all over. They had these strange, hairless faces, and their proportions were off. Their movements weren't human. The more I read, the more isolated I felt. Some accounts came close. There were reports of similar creatures in Northern California, especially around water sources. but nothing exact. I felt crazy even looking it up. I never told my husband. We were already having problems, and I knew how it would sound. I did try to tell my mom once, but she just gave me this look, the same one she gave me when I was a kid, and swore there was something under my bed. So I stopped talking about it altogether. For months afterward, I had nightmares about those black eyes. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced something was watching me through our bedroom window. I started avoiding news about the Northern California coast, terrified I'd see reports of people going missing near Oric. Every time we planned a family trip up to Oregon, I'd find excuses to fly instead of drive. The worst part is the not knowing. Were they some undiscovered species? Some kind of, I don't even know what to call them. They clearly weren't human, but they weren't bears or any animal I recognize either. They moved with purpose, like they were intelligent. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen them. That stretch of highway isn't exactly bustling, but other people must drive it every day. Did anyone else slow down and see what I saw? Or did they speed by, missing it completely? I've never gone back to that exact spot. I couldn't even tell you precisely where it was, just somewhere south of Oric along that lagoon. Part of me wants to return, to prove to myself I didn't imagine it. The rest of me knows that's a terrible idea. My son is in his 20s now. He has no memory of that day. He slept through the whole thing, thankfully. Sometimes, when we're together and drive past bodies of water, I get this knot in my stomach. I find myself scanning the shoreline, both hoping and fearing I'll see those figures again. I don't know why I'm sharing this now after all these years. Maybe because enough time has passed that the memory has lost some of its sharp edges. Or maybe because I still wake up sometimes with the image of that creature's profile burned into my mind. Its strange posture, its inhuman proportions, those black eyes staring out at nothing. What haunts me most isn't the fear I felt that day. It's the realization that these things were just existing, going about whatever business creatures like that have, searching for food or materials or whatever they were doing in that lagoon. They weren't there to scare humans or attack passers-by. They were just living their lives in some parallel world that occasionally intersects with ours. And that means they're probably still out there somewhere. Maybe in that same lagoon, maybe in other bodies of water up and down the coast, going about their business, indifferent to our existence, occasionally being spotted by some random driver who, like me, will question their sanity for years to come. I've seen all the shows and documentaries about Bigfoot and other cryptids, but what I saw wasn't a shaggy ape man crashing through the forest. These were something else entirely, something that seemed almost at home in the water as on land. Something that moved wrong and had eyes like bottomless pits. Whenever I hear people dismiss cryptid sightings as hoaxes or misidentifications, I want to speak up. I want to tell them about that crystal clear morning when I saw something that shouldn't exist. But I stay quiet, because I know how it sounds. I know they'd look at me the same way my mom did. So I've kept this to myself all these years. I've never gone to any Bigfoot conventions or called those TV shows that investigate strange sightings. What would be the point? I don't have photos or videos, just my memory, which grows less and less reliable with each passing year. But I know what I saw that day. 2 non-human, bipedal creatures in a lagoon off Highway 101, one standing in water that should have been chest-deep on a normal person but barely reached its thighs. I saw its wet, groomed fur catching the morning sunlight. I saw its black eyes and expressionless face. I saw it move with those strange, exaggerated arm swings. And sometimes I still feel like it's seeing me too, across all these years and miles. Like somewhere in the back of my mind, there's a connection that never quite broke. A door that opened that day and never fully closed. I don't drive that stretch of 101 anymore. I found alternate routes. Or I fly. I tell people it's because the coastal highway makes me carsick, or because I'm afraid of landslides. The truth is too bizarre to share. but sometimes I wonder how many other people have seen them. How many others carry this same secret, too afraid of ridicule to speak up? How many others slow down when they pass bodies of water, scanning the surface for something they hope they'll never see again? Story 13. I've never shared this with anyone outside of my immediate family and closest friends, because honestly, who would believe me? Even now, typing this out, my hands are shaking a bit. What happened that night at Beal Air Force Base has haunted me for years. I keep telling myself there must be some logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw. This happened back in November 2009. My buddy Mike Thompson and I decided to go deer hunting. We'd been planning this trip for months. Mike's a good guy, been friends since high school, and we'd go hunting together at least once a year. This time, we decided to try our luck in the hills above Marysville, California. Now, I should probably mention right off the bat that technically we weren't supposed to be there. The land was part of the closed Beal Air Force Base property, but locals had been sneaking in to hunt there for years. The deer population was thriving since it was basically undisturbed most of the time. We figured the worst that could happen was getting kicked out with a warning if we were caught. Mike brought his 2 retrievers, beautiful dogs named Buck and Duke. They were well-trained hunting dogs, and Mike was really proud of them. We arrived in the afternoon, parking Mike's truck about a half-mile from where we planned to set up camp. We hiked in with our gear, just the essentials: 2 tents, sleeping bags, some food, our rifles, and ammo. We found a decent spot in the old barracks area. It was perfect, partially sheltered by some trees, but with a good view of the surrounding area. The barracks themselves were nothing special, just old, abandoned military buildings that had seen better days. Windows broken, doors missing, covered in graffiti, but the area around them had a small clearing that was perfect for our camp. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and spent the late afternoon scouting the area for deer tracks. Found plenty of promising signs, fresh droppings, some clear tracks heading toward a creek about a quarter-mile away. Everything seemed perfect for an early morning hunt the next day. As the sun started setting, we got a fire going and cooked some canned chili. Mike cracked open some beers, and we just sat there talking about work, family, the usual stuff. The dogs were relaxed, lounging by the fire. Buck occasionally getting up to sniff around the perimeter of our camp, but nothing unusual. It must have been around 10 p.m. when it happened. The fire had died down to embers, and we were just about ready to turn in for the night. The temperature had dropped considerably, and there was this eerie stillness in the air. No wind, no distant traffic sounds, nothing but the occasional pop from the dying fire. That's when we heard it. A scream, but not like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, and it definitely wasn't human. It was this long, drawn-out howl that started low and then rose in pitch before suddenly cutting off. The sound echoed through the hills, and I swear I felt it in my chest. It was loud, like whatever made it was maybe 100 yards away in the woods beyond the old barracks. Mike and I both froze. We looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in his face. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, Buck and Duke went absolutely ballistic. Their ears perked up, and they started barking furiously, straining against their leashes that were tied to a nearby tree. Then, before Mike could grab them, Buck broke free and took off toward the sound, with Duke following seconds later after snapping his leash too. "Shit!" Mike yelled, jumping up and grabbing his rifle. "We gotta get them!" I didn't want to go toward whatever made that sound, but I couldn't let Mike go alone, and we couldn't leave the dogs. I grabbed my Remington 700 and my flashlight, and we headed after them. The dogs barking guided us as we moved cautiously through the darkness, our flashlights cutting thin beams through the night. We approached the wooded area where the sound had come from, about 100 yards from camp. The barking had changed. It wasn't just excited hunting dog barks anymore. There was fear in their sounds, mixed with aggressive growling. "Buck! Duke! Get back here!" Mike called out, his voice tense. We pushed through some brush and entered a small clearing surrounded by oak trees and manzanita. In the crossing beams of our flashlights, I saw the dogs. They were circling something big that was standing between two large oak trees. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The flashlight only caught glimpses as it moved, a massive dark shape, much taller than a man. But what shocked me to my core was that it was standing on two legs. The dogs were trying to corner it, barking and lunging, then retreating. Buck made a bold move and got too close. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. This thing reached down, grabbed Buck around the middle with one arm, and literally threw him. I'm not exaggerating. It threw a 70-pound retriever like it was nothing more than a stuffed toy. Buck hit a tree about 15 feet away with a yelp and crumpled to the ground. Mike screamed his dog's name and raised his rifle, but Duke was still in there, still trying to attack. The creature swung at Duke, who barely dodged the blow. That's when I managed to get my flashlight beam directly on it for a split second. God, I wish I hadn't. What I saw was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark hair or fur, with massive shoulders and arms that hung lower than a human should. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. I only caught a glimpse before it turned away from the light, but it was like a nightmare version of an ape face, with deep-set eyes that reflected my flashlight with an eerie yellow-green glow. Mike saw it too. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "It's got a face like a fucking ape." The creature let out another one of those screams, the same as we'd heard from camp, but so much louder up close that it felt like my eardrums would burst. Then it turned and bounded away into the thicker trees beyond the clearing. It didn't run like a person. It was more like it took these massive strides, covering ground in a way that didn't seem possible. We were frozen for a moment. Then Mike rushed to Buck, who was struggling to his feet, whimpering. Miraculously, he seemed injured but alive. Duke was still barking in the direction the creature had gone. "Call your dog, Mike," I hissed, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, half expecting that thing to come charging back at us. Mike whistled sharply, and Duke finally came back to him, still growling toward the woods. We backed away slowly, rifles ready, until we felt it was safe to turn and move more quickly back to camp. When we got there, Mike checked Buck over. He had some bruised ribs and was favoring his right leg, but nothing seemed broken. It was a miracle, considering how hard he'd been thrown. We didn't even discuss what to do next. Without a word, we started breaking down the camp, throwing our gear haphazardly into our backpacks. Every sound from the woods made us jump, and I kept my rifle close the entire time. "We need to get the hell out of here," Mike said, his voice shaking. "Whatever that thing was, it's still out there." It took us maybe 20 minutes to pack everything essential. We left some of the heavier gear behind. We could come back for it in daylight if we dared. Mike carried Buck, who was too hurt to walk the half-mile back to the truck. I led the way with my flashlight in one hand and my rifle in the other, with Duke sticking close to my heels, still on alert. That walk back to the truck was the longest of my life. Every shadow looked like that creature. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. I kept thinking I could feel it watching us, following us. When we finally reached the truck, we threw everything in the back, loaded the dogs carefully, and got the hell out of there, tires spinning on the dirt road. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. What was there to say? We'd both seen it, but neither of us had words to properly describe what it was. Mike was focused on getting Buck to an emergency vet, and I was just trying to process what had happened. Years later, I was watching some nature show on TV. They played a recording of what they claimed was a Bigfoot vocalization captured somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I nearly fell out of my chair. It was identical to what we'd heard that night, that same haunting, howling scream that started low and rose in pitch. Mike and I still talk about that night sometimes, though not often. Buck recovered fully, though Duke became much more aggressive towards strangers after that night. We never went back to those woods. And we never told many people about what happened. Who would believe us anyway? I know how this sounds. I was a skeptic before that night, the kind of person who'd roll my eyes at stories like this. But when you see something with your own eyes that shouldn't exist, it changes you. It changes how you look at the world, at the wilderness. I still go hunting, but I'm different now. More cautious, more aware. I never hunt alone, and I never stay in the woods after dark if I can help it. Because now I know there are things out there that science can't explain, things that most people go their whole lives without encountering. And honestly, they're the lucky ones. I don't know what we saw that night at Beal. Maybe it was a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Maybe it was something else entirely, but it was real, it was powerful, and it was intelligent enough to be territorial, to want to scare us away. And it worked. It's been 13 years, and I still get chills thinking about those eyes reflecting in my flashlight beam, that impossible strength as it threw a full-grown retriever like it weighed nothing. Sometimes when I'm camping and hear branches breaking in the distance, my mind immediately goes back to that night, and I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering. The worst part is not knowing. Not having proof beyond our experience. Not being able to explain to people why I now get nervous in dense forests, why the sound of something large moving through underbrush makes me reach for a weapon that isn't there. I've read the scientific explanations people give for Bigfoot sightings, mistaken bears, hoaxes, the human mind playing tricks in low light, but none of those explain what Mike and I saw. None of them explain how Buck got those injuries or why 2 trained hunting dogs were so terrified. So I keep this story mostly to myself. But sometimes, like tonight, I need to put it out there, even anonymously, because it happened. Because that thing is out there in the hills above Marysville, in the closed property of Beal Air Force Base. And maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen it too, and I'm not crazy after all. Story 14. I've debated whether to share this for a long time now. It's been over 20 years, and I still get chills just thinking about it. My hunting buddy Derek and I experienced something in 2002 that changed how we feel about being in the woods, especially at dusk. I'm not claiming anything definitively, but what we encountered defies any normal explanation I can come up with. For context, my family owns a decent chunk of property in Sonoma County, California, right up against Pine Mountain. It's beautiful country, rolling hills, mixed forest, lots of wildlife, perfect hunting grounds with good deer populations. We'd been hunting there since we were teenagers, without incident. That summer, late August 2002, Derek and I decided to do a weekend hunting trip. We'd been best friends since high school and had our routine down pat. We set up our base camp near an old logging road on the lower part of the property. Nothing fancy, just a couple tents, a fire pit and our gear. The first day went normal. We got there around noon, set up camp, did some scouting, had a few beers around the fire, and turned in. It was the second day when things got weird. We woke up before dawn, had some instant coffee and energy bars, and headed out while it was still dark. Our plan was to work our way up the mountain using an old overgrown camp road that hadn't been maintained in years. It was barely more than a trail at that point, but it made for easier hiking than bushwhacking straight uphill. The morning was cool and misty, typical for that time of year. As the sun came up, we started noticing a ton of bear sign, scat, turned over logs, claw marks on trees. Nothing unusual for the area, but there was more than we typically saw. We weren't worried. Black bears in California usually want nothing to do with humans. About an hour into our hike, we reached a section of the trail where some pine branches hung low over the path, creating this natural tunnel you had to duck under. Derek was leading, and he suddenly stopped and crouched down. "Rob, check this out," he said, pointing at the ground. In a depression under those pine branches was what looked like a footprint. Not a bear print. Bears have distinctive paw prints with claws. This was different. It was big, way bigger than my boot, and had what appeared to be 5 toes. The impression wasn't perfect because the ground was covered in pine needles, but you could clearly see where something heavy had compressed the soil. "What do you think?" Derek asked, looking up at me. "Mountain lion," I suggested, though I knew mountain lion tracks don't look anything like that. "Too big, wrong shape," Derek said. He was right. We stared at it for a minute, then decided to keep going. Neither of us said the word that was on both our minds. About 50 yards further down the trail, we hit a wall of smell. I can't emphasize enough how bizarre this was. One second we were walking along, and the next it was like walking face first into an invisible cloud of the most putrid odor I've ever experienced. It was like a combination of skunk spray, wet dog, and something rotting, but stronger than any of those things individually. The weirdest part was how localized it was. We literally walked through it, stepped out of it, then turned around and walked back through it again. It wasn't like the wind carried it or it dissipated. It stayed in that exact spot like a wall. "What the hell is that?" I remember asking, pulling my shirt over my nose. Derek looked around nervously. "I don't know, but I've never smelled anything like it." Near this spot with the smell, on the side of the trail, was a pile of acorns, fresh oak acorns. A big pile, like someone had gathered them deliberately and set them there. The strange thing was, there weren't any oak trees in the immediate vicinity. The closest oaks were down the hill, maybe a quarter-mile away. We stood there trying to make sense of it. Derek finally said what we'd both been thinking. "Something collected these, brought them here from somewhere else." I nodded, feeling the hair on my arms stand up despite the morning warmth. "Look at where we are," Derek continued. "Under the pine overhang, near that impression in the ground. If something wanted to set up an ambush spot..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We decided to continue with our hunt, but I could feel a new tension between us. We'd been hunting these woods for years and never experienced anything like this. Both of us had our rifles. I was carrying my dad's old .30-06. Derek had his Remington 700, but suddenly they felt inadequate. Our usual hunting method was to separate and leapfrog up the mountain. One of us would move ahead about 50 steps while the other stayed put. Then the second person would pass the first and go another 50 steps. This way we could cover ground efficiently while still staying in relative proximity to each other. We split up and started this pattern, me taking the first movement. I went my 50 steps and stopped, waiting for Derek to pass me. While I was standing there, I heard a distinct whistle from off to my right, maybe 30 yards through the trees. It wasn't a bird call I recognized. It was too deliberate, almost like a signal. I assumed it was Derek trying to get my attention, though it didn't sound like his usual whistle. I whistled back, but got no response. When Derek finally passed me a few minutes later, I asked him about it. "Did you whistle a minute ago?" He looked confused. "No, I thought I heard you whistle from up ahead." That sent a chill up my spine. We were the only ones supposed to be on this property. My family is strict about trespassers, and the nearest public land is miles away. We continued our leapfrog pattern, but now both of us were on high alert. About 20 minutes later, while I was waiting for Derek to pass my position, I heard what sounded like a boulder rolling down the hillside, followed by the cracking of branches. It came from a spot where Derek couldn't possibly have been. When we finally met up at our designated rendezvous point at the top of the ridge, both of us looked shaken. "Did you hear that rock?" I asked. Derek nodded. "Yeah, but I was nowhere near there. Did you see anything?" I shook my head. "No, but I've been feeling like..." I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Like something's been following us." Derek finished my thought. "Exactly. Like it's timing its movements with ours, moving when we move so we can't hear it." We stood there on the ridge, looking back down the way we'd come. The forest suddenly seemed different, less familiar, more threatening. The morning sun was fully up now, but shadows still clung to the thicker parts of the woods. I found myself scanning those shadows, half expecting to see something staring back. "Let's stick together from here on out," Derek suggested. I agreed immediately. We spent the rest of that day hunting together, never letting the other out of sight. We didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us whip our heads around. Needless to say, we didn't get a deer that day. Any animal within half a mile could probably sense our tension. That night back at camp, we talked about what we'd experienced. Derek had been reading about Bigfoot sightings in Northern California, and while I'd always considered those stories to be bullshit, suddenly I wasn't so sure. The footprint, the smell, the collected acorns, the whistling, the feeling of being stalked, it all fit with accounts I'd heard but never taken seriously. We decided to cut our trip short and head home the next morning. Neither of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we were. Something was out there. Something intelligent enough to track us. Something that didn't want to be seen. The following year, in 2003, we decided to return. Maybe it was stubbornness or curiosity, but we convinced ourselves that we'd overreacted. Natural explanations probably existed for everything we'd experienced. That trip started fine. On the second day, we actually got lucky, and Derek shot a nice 4-point buck. We field-dressed it at camp, planning to pack it out the next morning. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, feeling pretty good about ourselves. Then, from somewhere up on the mountain, the exact area where we'd had our strange experiences the year before, came a sound that froze us both. It was a scream, but not like anything I'd heard before. Not a mountain lion. I've heard those, and they sound like a woman being murdered. This was deeper, more guttural, but with an almost ape-like quality to it. It echoed across the valley, lasting several seconds. We sat in silence after it faded. The fire popped and hissed, seeming suddenly smaller and more fragile. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek just shook his head. "I don't know." We barely slept that night. The feeling of being watched from the darkness beyond our campfire was overwhelming. The next morning, we packed up the deer and our gear faster than we ever had before and got the hell out of there. We've been back to hunt on the property since then, but never in that specific area. I've tried to come up with rational explanations for what we experienced. Maybe the footprint was from a bear with an injured paw. Maybe the smell was some weird fungus or plant. Maybe the whistles were from some bird species we weren't familiar with. But when I put it all together, the deliberate pile of collected acorns, the localized stench, the coordinated movements that seemed to shadow us, that inhuman scream, I can't convince myself it was all coincidental. To this day, Derek and I talk about it sometimes, usually after a few beers when our guard is down. We don't claim to know what was tracking us on Pine Mountain, but we both agree on one thing. Something intelligent was observing us, learning our patterns, maybe even trying to communicate in its own way. Whatever it was smart enough to stay hidden and patient enough to watch us for hours. And that, honestly, is what scares me the most. I've spent my whole life in those woods, thinking I understood what was out there. Now I know better. I still go hunting, but I never stay out after dark anymore, and I always have the feeling that I'm being watched. Story 15. I've debated whether to share this for a long time. My experience from 1988 still haunts me, and most people I've told either think I'm crazy or making it up. But I know what Scott and I saw that morning, and I'm finally ready to put it out there. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. It was early October 1988, peak deer hunting season in Northern California. My buddy Scott Parker and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd saved up our vacation days and scouted this remote spot in the Mendocino National Forest that Scott's uncle had told us about. Supposedly a prime area for black-tailed deer that didn't get much hunting pressure because it was so damn hard to reach. We left Sacramento around 2 a.m. to make the drive, my old '76 Ford F-150 loaded with our gear. It was cold as hell that morning, that crisp fall cold that bites at your fingers and makes your breath hang in the air. We'd packed thermoses of coffee and wore those thick flannel shirts and orange vests that were practically the uniform for hunters back then. The last hour of the drive was on these neglected Forest Service roads, all dirt and potholes that rattled my teeth even at crawling speed. We finally reached the spot around 5 a.m., still pitch black out. The plan was to park at the base of this ridge, then hike up once we had enough light to see where we were going. Scott and I sat in the truck with the heater running, nursing our coffee and talking about nothing important. Work stuff. Some girl he'd met at a bar the weekend before. Just killing time until dawn. The windows were fogging up from our breath, and I kept having to wipe them down to check the sky. Around 5:45, the darkness started giving way to that grey, pre-dawn light. Not bright enough to see clearly, but enough to make out the ridge ahead of us and the basic outline of trees. Scott suggested we start unloading our gear, so I killed the engine and we quietly got out. The silence hit me first. No birds, no wind, just this heavy stillness that felt watchful. I remember thinking that was a good sign for hunting, less noise to alert the deer. We were whispering to each other as we checked our rifles and loaded our packs, when Scott suddenly froze mid-sentence. "Tim," he whispered, "look up there." I followed his gaze up to the ridge, maybe 200 yards away. There was someone up there, a dark figure moving around in what looked like black clothing. Even in the dim light, we could tell it was big, over 6 feet tall at least. The figure was bent over, digging or searching through some brush, then would stand up and scan the area before going back to whatever it was doing. "Another hunter," I whispered. Scott shook his head. "No orange vest. And where's his truck? We didn't pass anyone on the way in." He was right. The Forest Service road we'd taken was the only viable access point for miles, and who would be hunting without proper gear at this hour? The figure had no visible rifle, no flashlight that we could see, nothing that would make sense for someone in these woods before dawn. We both instinctively crouched lower behind my truck, watching. I felt this crawling sensation up my spine. Something wasn't right. "Maybe it's Forest Service," Scott suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The figure suddenly stopped what it was doing and stood fully upright. Even at that distance, in that pale dawn light, I could tell it was massive, broad-shouldered and tall. Then it turned and began walking directly down the ridge toward us. "It sees us," Scott hissed. I shook my head. "Can't have. We're in the shadows here." But the figure kept coming, moving with this strange, fluid gait down the ridge. Not running, just walking with purpose, directly at us, each step bringing it closer, moving through the trees like it knew exactly where they were without looking. "Get the binoculars," I told Scott, not taking my eyes off the figure. Scott fumbled in his pack and passed them to me. My hands were trembling slightly as I raised them to my eyes and adjusted the focus. The figure was closer now, maybe 100 yards away, moving steadily through the underbrush. What I saw in those lenses made my blood run cold. It wasn't a person. The realization hit Scott and me at the exact same moment. I heard his sharp intake of breath match my own. What we were looking at wasn't human. It walked like a man, upright on 2 legs, but it was covered in jet black fur that had this strange sheen to it, even in the dim light. The face. God, the face was what haunts me still. Not quite ape, not quite human, and around the eyes was this reddish coloration like rust or dried blood that stood out against the black. "What the fuck is that?" Scott whispered, his voice cracking. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. My mind was racing through possibilities. A bear walking upright? Some kind of elaborate prank? But I knew better. We were looking at what people around these parts called Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you want to give it, but this wasn't the brown, shaggy creature from the Patterson film. This thing was black as night with those haunting red eye rings. It kept coming now, about 75 yards away. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking badly now. Part of me wanted to jump in the truck and floor it. But another part, the part that had hunted all my life, wanted to document this, to see it clearly. I'm going to get a better look, I whispered, reaching slowly for my truck door. Scott grabbed my arm. Are you insane? Let's get out of here. But I was transfixed. I had to see it clearly. I carefully reached for the door handle and pulled it as gently as I could. The latch, however, had other ideas. That old Ford's door let out a loud metallic clank that echoed through the silent forest. The sound might as well have been a gunshot. The creature stopped dead in its tracks about 50 yards away now. It turned its head sharply toward us, those red-ringed eyes seeming to lock onto mine. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other, me half-crouched by my truck door, it standing motionless on the slope. Then it moved. I've never seen anything living move that fast. 1 second it was standing still. The next, it was sprinting through the trees with a speed that defied logic for something that size. It didn't crash through the underbrush like you'd expect. It moved with this terrifying grace, weaving between trees, barely disturbing the vegetation. I fumbled for my rifle, trying to get the scope up to my eye, but by the time I found it in the viewfinder, the creature had already covered another 30 yards and disappeared behind a massive Douglas fir. Did you see that? Scott was practically hyperventilating. Jesus Christ, did you see how fast it moved? I nodded, unable to form words. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. We waited, rifles trained on the area where we'd last seen it, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the forest slowly brightening with dawn. We should go, Scott said after a minute that felt like an hour. But I couldn't leave without knowing, without confirming what we'd seen. Maybe there was a logical explanation, something that would make sense in the light of day. I need to look, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Just a quick check. You're out of your fucking mind, Scott hissed. That thing could tear us apart. It ran away from us, I reasoned, though my legs felt like jelly. Just cover me. I'll be quick. Before I could change my mind, I started walking toward the tree where the creature had disappeared. My rifle clutched so tightly my knuckles were white. Scott cursed but followed a few paces behind me, his own rifle ready. The forest was coming alive now. Birds starting their morning calls, the first real light of day filtering through the canopy. It should have been reassuring, but it only made the silence that had preceded it more unnerving. When we reached the Douglas fir, I circled it cautiously, expecting, I don't know what. The creature crouched behind it, some sign of its passage, but there was nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed earth, no footprints in the patches of soft soil. It's like it vanished, I murmured, scanning the surrounding area. Scott was looking up at the tree. You don't think it could climb, do you? I followed his gaze up the massive trunk. The lowest branches were at least 15 feet up, but the bark was rough enough to potentially provide handholds. Still, for something that large to climb, that quickly and silently seemed impossible. We spent the next hour combing the area in an ever-widening circle, looking for any evidence of what we'd seen. Nothing. Not a single track, not a hair, not a broken twig that couldn't be explained by wind or other animals. Maybe we imagined it, Scott suggested, though his pale face and shaking hands told me he didn't believe that for a second. I shook my head. We both saw it. Same thing at the same time. By 8 a.m. the forest was fully bright, alive with normal sounds and movements. We should have been on the ridge. in our planned hunting spots. Instead, we were standing in a patch of forest, sweating despite the cool morning, searching for something that had apparently evaporated into thin air. "I don't think we're going to find anything, Tim," Scott finally said, "and honestly, I don't want to hunt here anymore." I nodded slowly. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling hollow and uncertain. "Yeah, let's go." We walked back to the truck in silence, both of us constantly scanning the trees. I kept seeing movement from the corner of my eye, only to find nothing when I turned to look. The forest that had seemed so familiar, so much my element, now felt alien and threatening. We packed our gear without speaking much. As I was loading my rifle case into the truck bed, Scott suddenly grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Tim," he whispered, nodding toward the ridge where we'd first spotted the creature. I turned slowly, my heart rate instantly spiking again. There was nothing visible on the ridge, but I felt it, the sensation of being watched, so intense it was almost a physical pressure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming certainty that it was up there, hidden among the trees, observing us. "Let's go," I said, slamming the tailgate shut. "Now!" We got in the truck, and I turned the key with trembling fingers. The engine coughed once, twice, before rumbling to life. I'd never been so grateful for that sound. I backed up, turned around, and drove away much faster than the rutted road warranted, the truck bouncing and sliding as we put distance between ourselves and whatever had been on that ridge. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen wasn't supposed to exist. By silent agreement, we stopped at a diner about 2 hours from the forest, ordered coffee, and tried to process it. "We should report it," Scott said finally. I laughed, a hollow sound. "To who? Forest Service? Sheriff?" "Excuse me, officer. We'd like to report a Bigfoot sighting. They'd think we were drunk or crazy." He nodded, staring into his coffee. "So we just what? Pretend it didn't happen?" I shrugged. "What choice do we have? You have any evidence? Because I don't." We finished our coffee and hit the road again. By the time we reached Sacramento, we'd constructed a story about engine trouble and decided to try again next weekend at a different spot. We never did, though. Scott moved to Oregon the following spring, and I haven't been back to those woods since. That was over 30 years ago now. I still hunt, but never alone, and never without that creeping feeling between my shoulder blades that something might be watching me from the trees. I'm especially wary around large objects that might conceal something. Big trees, rock outcroppings, abandoned structures, and I've become the guy who constantly looks over his shoulder on hunting trips, who insists on keeping the fire going all night at camp. The rational part of my brain tells me there must be an explanation. Maybe it was a bear with mange, or some other condition that made its fur look odd. Maybe it was another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit playing a prank. Maybe the stress and excitement of the hunt made us both see something that wasn't there. But I know what I saw. That jet-black fur with the strange sheen, those reddish eye rings, the impossible speed and silence of its movement, the way it completely vanished without a trace. I've read accounts of Bigfoot sightings over the years, but none that quite match what Scott and I encountered. Most describe brown or reddish fur, not the black we saw. None mention the red around the eyes. And most Bigfoot stories describe creatures that crash through the underbrush, not something that moved with the silent precision of a predator. Whatever it was, it changed how I see the wilderness. The forests I'd loved all my life suddenly held secrets I'd never suspected, dangers I couldn't prepare for. There are things out there we don't understand, things that shouldn't exist but do, and sometimes they look right back at us.